Good morning, everyone. Good to see you again. We start in 1 minute. Ludger, you'd be ready to go, right?
Yes. How do you feel, my dear friend?
Thanks for asking. I'm very well. Very mild symptoms. It's not nothing, but the symptoms are still very mild. Slight cold, but that's it.
You're a
So
little crazy to sit there. You could also be in bed, you know.
no, it's really so mild that I would in any case participate. No, it's fine. But
Okay.
many thanks for asking.
Well, many thanks for staying. However, it's a really great contribution to make, and you deserve to be in bed and to relax. But it's tough, and yeah, and bad luck, as I mentioned to you already. You know, having postponed the meeting for 2 years, and now it's happening this week. That's tough.
Yeah, that's true. That is really bad luck. Yeah, as you said, I postponed the conference for 2 years, and right on the spot, I contract the virus. Well,
Mm.
as long as it stays mild, I won't complain. I I'm I consider myself lucky that I have mild symptoms.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, good to see you all online mostly. Good that we set it up as a hybrid conference. Thanks again for everyone in the team making this possible, especially Till for the technology for making this event possible. Right, without further ado, let me introduce our speaker, our first speaker for today. It's a great pleasure, Ludger, that you can be here with us. Ludger Schwarte is professor of philosophy at the Kunstakademie in Düsseldorf. After having taught as an assistant professor of image theory at the University of Basel and as a professor of aesthetics at the Zurich University of Arts. He studied philosophy, literature, and political sciences in Münster, Berlin, and Paris, and attained his PhD and habilitation in philosophy at Freie University in Berlin. His areas of specializations are aesthetics, political philosophy, philosophy of culture, ontology, history of science. In his talk, Ludger will address the question which aspects of proprioceptive practice would make it an aesthetic practice and which, in difference to these, would make it an artwork. Thanks, Ludger, for being here. I hand over to you.
Many thanks, Marcus, and also many thanks to you and your team for the invitation. I find this very thrilling and the topic and very inspiring. So many thanks that you include me in your efforts. As has been already mentioned several times, it's certainly true that aspects of proprioceptive practice and aesthetics can be observed as recurrent and even augmenting in the contemporary art sphere. And it is really worth an effort to philosophically determine what the contribution precisely is. And I consider what I'm now about to do as part of that effort. For an introduction, let me make three framing remarks to situate from where I speak. Following Adorno and others, I presuppose a distinction between cultural practices and products on the one hand and artworks on the other. They don't overlap. So, for instance, dancing or drawing are cultural practices, or making a film, and that is not art, or not by that, you know. Second, following Jacques Rancière, Christine Ross, Peter Osborne, Juliane Rebentisch, and others, I presuppose that art can neither be conceived as in antiquity through ethical terms, nor as in Renaissance as a set of skills and practices, such as painting, sculpture, poetry, music, etc. So if you paint you are not thereby an artist. Many people paint their body, paint walls, paint sheets, and don't produce art. Nor as a modernism through media specificity. It's not an artwork when I do tease out the properties of painting that I produce thereby an artwork. Because there's a distinction to be made, that's my third presupposition, an ontological shift or discontinuity between all those concepts. The latest between modern art and contemporary art, which makes that contrary to architecture, where you might say that the work of a contemporary architect, if he builds or she builds a house, that could still be recognized by Stone Age architect as a house. What contemporary artists do could not have been recognized by modern artists even as an artwork. You know, there's this famous thought experiment from the late 50s, I think, even that following Duchamp and others, one was asked if one could pick out in a shop or so the artwork. And I would guess that it is not true for even the distinction of contemporary to modern artists. Not a modern artist could not pick out, for instance, what Tino Segal does when he creates his situations as an artwork, because the concept has ontologically shifted. And that's special for art, that, so to speak, the history of art is not made in form of an evolution or of stable concepts, but there are breaks and disruptions. In what follows, I will concentrate on an analysis of artistic practice, because I am at odds with the dominant aesthetic tradition that still is dominant today, which takes the appearance of a product, the aesthetic object, for granted and concentrates on the aesthetic experience. An example of this would be all those approaches to proprioceptive art we have heard so far, which claim that the aesthetic experience on the side of the public or spectators is what makes something a proprioceptive artwork. So for instance, all these approaches that spoke of either the experience or the appreciation take that the decisive turn by which something becomes an artwork lies in the reception, so to speak. But if I succeed in convincing you that a distinction should be made between aesthetic and artistic practice and or experience, what about the experience of proprioception? Is there a genuinely proprioceptive art? Or isn't proprioception mainly a sensation on the self in movement, a perception? What does it entail to consider it as an aesthetic phenomenon? Which aspects of a proprioceptive practice would make it an aesthetic practice, and which, in difference to these, would make it an artwork? Take, for instance, Thomas Saraceno's installation in orbit, suspended at a height of more than 25 meters above the piazza of K21. If it is to count as an example of proprioceptive art, then neither the design of the steel mesh structure nor its relation to the air-filled spheres, which are said to form a surreal landscape, or as it says, a sea of clouds or floating planetary bodies, nor the relation of this intervention to the architecture of the art institution are decisive for it to be an artwork. But the fact that it is accessible to the public, that the public can move in and around this installation. Not the technical object, but the experience you make with it would be to be qualified as artistic. To cover the essential aspects of artistic practice, I have proposed and propose again in this talk to use the verb arting, which is certainly in need of explanation. In German, I call this Kunsten. In German and in English too, a verb form is missing for the noun art, Kunst. To art, therefore, means to practice some form of art, or rather the infinitive becoming of art. Arting means to transform something outside the art world into something artistic. Now, what is artistic? Three philosophical approaches explain such a movement. It's Dickey's institutional theory that would say, as you know, that something becomes a work of art once it is in art institutions. Markus Schenker has been referring to this. I don't consider myself, by the way, really an institutional theorist, but I know there's some aspects of this in my argument. But it's not convincing to the extent that, for instance, chairs, toilets, and people are in art institutions, and they are not artworks. So one needs to differentiate there. Arthur Dento's approach is to say that it is an object plus interpretation. So the difference between the not artwork and the artwork is that the urinal, for instance, has an interpretation with it when it is Duchamp's artwork. And Theodor Adorno utters the requirement, which I find even more convincing, that something aesthetic becomes an artwork through interpretation, comment, and criticism. But all of these focus on the reception of an aesthetic object, on aesthetic experience, and entirely neglect the productive aspect. Some X, be it an object or an event, is attributed an artistic meaning, but the production, existence, and qualities of this X are left out of these accounts. An easy and tempting explanation for this fact would be to say, well, philosophers of art think that something becomes art as soon as philosophers of art think that this something is art. But philosophical thinking is not only involved in the reflexive experience and criticism of art experience, or of artworks, but already in the acts of invention and conception, as I will try to spell out. So, how do you give an account for what artists do? Now, what do they do? At first glance, things seem simple. When an artist works, she produces a work of art. But is it really work? Hannah Arendt says work is reproduction. So making artworks is not work. But is it production? Hannah Arendt differentiates between work, production, and acting. Is it production? Is the core of what artists do the production of aesthetic objects comparable to jewelry, interior design, and fine cooking? Is it a manufacturing production of investment products, products destined for consumption or for aesthetic contemplation? I propose to differentiate in the second step now between aesthetic and artistic practices. Aesthetics, as you know, is concerned, that could be a basic definition, is concerned with the reflection on modes of perception, including objects, representation, and aesthetic judgments. What are aesthetic practices? It is not just the practice of receiving, of seeing, listening, experiencing, interpreting a work, a meal, a view. Aesthetic practices are all those where attention is paid to the way we perceive things, They form a reflection on perceptual processes and prepare aesthetic judgments, like taste judgments. However, aesthetic practices are not primarily concerned with these judgments, but first and foremost with evoking and experiencing aesthetic qualities. Baking cakes, tasting wine, visiting places of interest, designing gardens, cutting hair, applying makeup, and making coffee. All these are aesthetic practices. They are not necessarily professional activities as such, like designing fashion, decorating houses, erecting graves, making tattoos. Their purpose, also as amateur practices, is not to make money or to gain social esteem. All aesthetic activities, amateur or professional, be it painting, music, or pottery and gardening, are not primarily intended for reception. It is not about feeling pleasure or gaining social distinction. One performs an aesthetic practice not to achieve such an effect, because it is not replaceable by other practices that will have the same effect, like taking drugs or by immersive illusion. But it is an end in itself, to focus attention on modes of perception. For most aesthetic practices, this quest to focus attention on modes of perception is the decisive element. We play the piano in order to play piano, not to listen to the sound produced by the piano. I cook because I love to cook, not just to feed myself. I paint because I like to paint, not to stir awe and interpretation. And of course, I like to sense how my body moves when I walk on Thomas Saraceno's In Orbit, or when I slay down Carsten Höller's test site. The same, I would hold, would go for people who do wingsuit base jumps. Aesthetic activities are carried out to bring out aesthetic qualities on an object or in a situation. The goal of the practice is the activity itself, in which the spontaneous element of the activity becomes manifest, to carry it out. Bringing out a floral arrangement with style, creating an impressive harmony, a beautiful form, these are spontaneous aesthetic achievements. It is attributable to me precisely because it wouldn't have occurred anyway, and because I didn't know exactly how it would be like, but I had to reflect on how to do it. Aesthetic practices are related to a specific vision on the dependence of aesthetic factors on the production of non-aesthetic qualities. Aesthetic effects are triggered by qualities that are themselves non-aesthetic, such as shape, color, sound, volume, movement. Now, even if spontaneity is at the center, there are two ways of carrying out. One based on know-how, the other trying something out. The arrangement of flowers or the interpretation of a musical composition aims at the repetition and variation of already known combinations of non-aesthetic qualities, such as flowers and notes. Rehearsing dances or periods in ice skating aim at acquiring an established capability. Many aesthetic practices are sufficient in this repetition variation, also cooking. Sometimes, however, aesthetic qualities go beyond repetition. They combine non-aesthetic qualities in a way to obtain new aesthetic qualities, a new recipe, for instance. Artistic practice, too, goes beyond repeated production based on know-how, on imitation and exercise, insofar as it is characterized by the vision of an initially hypothetical aesthetic effect that could be triggered by a combination of a new possible and feasible type of non-aesthetic qualities. In other words, innovative aesthetic practices and artistic practices are both based on the project of a hypothetical combination of non-aesthetic qualities. So first you think, I could make this, and yet then you try it out, and then you bring about either new aesthetic qualities or new artistic qualities. I differentiate the two at this point. Nick Zangwill, philosopher from Great Britain, calls this an aesthetic insight. It is true, all works of art contain, to whatever extent, in whatever dose, aesthetic qualities, and are based on such aesthetic insights. But the same goes for creative processes in design, in Hollywood and Bollywood film. Aesthetic insights keep the cultural industry alive. And I wouldn't count them in the artistic sphere in a more stricter sense. Again, as I said yesterday, you may, colloquially speaking, call someone an artist in chess playing or in I don't know what, football. It's okay, but if we philosophically try to differentiate and make clear what the difference is in these practices, I'm now concerned more with a stricter and normative concept of art, and try to tell you why I don't think every form of innovative cooking is really art, properly speaking. Therefore, it is important to draw a sharp distinction. Aesthetic qualities, beautiful, elegant, ugly, etc., are not the only or perhaps even the decisive qualities of works of art. In contrast to everyday objects, which are formally finished and shaped to be functional, works of art are assessed as daring, impudent, witty, and intelligent. These expressions, daring, impudent, witty, and intelligent, are expressions with which Arthur Dento marks out the qualities by which Duchamp's fountain differs from a urinal. Now, these attributions of qualities like daring, impudent, witty, and intelligent address a vision of possibilities and not actual aesthetic quality. Artistic and aesthetic criteria are therefore not identical. Aesthetic quality is a more or less directly perceptible quality of a work of art, like a successful form, a shocking color, a dissonant sound. Giri had a whole list of these aesthetic qualities, like also harmony, disharmony, etc., which may play a role in a work of art and which are directly perceptible. On the other hand, artistic quality, such as wit and originality, is a relational quality and implies a comparison with other events or instances or objects. So aesthetic qualities are perceptible, artistic qualities are relational. Daring, impudent, irreverent, witty, and intelligent distinguishes the understanding that precedes the realization, that which guides the project by means of epithets of epistemic knowledge. Artistic criteria are epistemic. They single something out in relation to a conceptual set. Artistic doing is therefore not exhausted in the production of aesthetic qualities. That's important now. The production of aesthetic qualities is something that is not at the core, or not anymore at the core. It was in the Renaissance and in the 18th century, but it's not anymore at the core of artistic doing, of what I call arting. The kind of understanding that is needed to make art, is not only the kind of understanding on which possible new ways of encouraging aesthetic qualities are based. An aesthetic insight, of which Nick Zangwill talks, is then just not enough. Rather, what is sought, one might say, is an artistic vision. In an artistic vision, the aesthetic insight is a necessary, but certainly not sufficient condition. So it's a necessary but not sufficient condition, since works of art cannot be distinguished from other things, or at least not exclusively, by aesthetic qualities. From Duchamp to Warhol to appropriation art and institutional critique, this has been fully demonstrated. An artistic realization is only indirectly dependent on the organization of our senses. Just because I draw, paint, make a film, make a video, rhyme, write a book, dance, or play the piano, that doesn't mean that I make art. Nor is it because I conjugate or combine material in a reflexive constellation that I make art. Because the same activities also appear in contexts that have nothing artistic about them, like DJ sets, documentaries, video games, or TV news. Sorry for those lads who defend video games as art, I don't. They may be artistic ways of going about it, but they are not for themselves artworks. Activities of this kind, in the sense of a combination of material and the organization of the senses for de novo produced non-aesthetic arrangements, can certainly be involved in the creation of art, but they are not or no longer the hallmarks of an artistic activity. The latter has emancipated itself from aesthetic practices. If I take the most mind-blowing drugs, or if I flip the most daring somersault, I'm certainly making an unheard of experience, also relative to others, but this relation is based on a specific type token relationship, like a kind of drug, a kind of somersault. An artistic insight will go after something that has no category yet. So an artistic insight is special insofar as it goes for something that has no category yet. It's not a type of token relationship. So make a painting, of course, it would be a token, another painting, but a painting as a painting is not an artwork. Juliane Rebentisch takes the opposite view. For her, a work of art is essentially the reflexive transformation of an object through experience. This transformation for her is uncontrollable, according to her, notably because the experience refers to appearance and therefore to the independence of works with regard to their performance. In appearance, objects open themselves to the process of transformation into art and give rise to all kinds of interpretative and imaginative acts by the subjects. These are performed as aesthetic judgments, says Juliane Rebentisch. But it is not only thanks to the institution, nor only thanks to experience or interpretation that works of art exist. Its objects or situations are not simply given, but mostly formed, gestaltet, I would say in German, formed and need to be reinvented. The experience of artworks is not directed at the same set of open objects every Sunday yet again, as most of my philosopher colleagues seem to stipulate, because for them they take always, works of art for granted and only underline with Umberto Eco that they are open to interpretation. Of course, they are open to interpretation, but first of all, you need the artworks, and then you can maybe then interpret and experience them. And most philosophers just take the existence of artworks for granted. And of course, that could be a self-sufficient play. There's a museum full of objects that you can always reinterpret, and that's what you do. But why? How would you explain the need for new object situations, new movements, disruptions in the art sphere, in the art practice? So the experience of artworks is not directed at the same set of objects, of open objects every Sunday yet again, but needs to expose itself to something that has no name yet. And that's what I call arting. Is art then the production of things of which we don't know what they are, as Adorno famously said? I find it a very useful pseudo-definition. Adorno says, as many wise, clever philosophers of art, you cannot define art. Like Rancière says the same thing, but then you find always, these tentative definitions nonetheless. And I find this the most advanced one. Art, he says, the utopia of art is to make things of which we don't know yet what they are. That's my rough English translation. His German is more elegant. To make art, we said, is to accomplish an artistic activity. Strictly speaking, the making itself does not characterize the artistic activity because studio assistants or production technicians can be entrusted with a task without them becoming artists for all that. Public climbing into Thomas Saraceno's installation does not, for that reason, become a group of artists. As long as they only produce or instantiate what others have imagined, the work is not attributed to them, even if they are ultimately admired for the qualities they have added to it. On closer inspection, an artist is not one who makes art. No one becomes an artist by perfectly copying and thereby making an artwork. Even the perfect execution of the unique, such as can be achieved by highly skilled assistants or technicians, like in recording engineer, for instance, does not make anyone an artist. The public, the spectators, are often part of the production of an artwork in interactive or relational aesthetic formats or in conceptual art, for instance. What elevates an artist above or beyond the group of performers, manufacturers, is her idea of something to be made, the invention of a new possibility, coupled with the development of a new way of making it. So it's a new starting, a new way to start. What is aimed at in arting is above all a spontaneous realization, a new mode of becoming. To art does not mean to make or produce anything. It means to carry out a reinvention of itself. Art has a specific history, not identical with cultural history, because it is constantly reinventing itself. Art must therefore be sought outside its conceptual and social institutions. It is a dynamic of negation. And for this very reason, there is art, but not the art, only plural and agonal approaches. The quarrel about what art will become is at the center of the concept of art. That is why the history of art is full of discontinuities or even ontological breaks. The originality of their idea seems to therefore be the requirement for works of art. Originality is a sufficient, but perhaps not the only condition for artworks. So I'd say I had a necessary condition. There's always some manifestation that may imply what I have called an aesthetic insight with Nick Zengel. That's a necessary condition. The sufficient one sufficient one, I'm not sure it's the only one, is originality in a way that I will now try to analyze. It's not, of course, innovativity in the neoliberal sense. I don't want to be misunderstood on this point. Originality here does not mean same, but different. Artistic creativity gives rise to ideas or objects or events of a new kind. In German, I would say neuartig, events of a new kind. Artistically relevant originality is genre novelty. It goes beyond the mere novelty of an aspect or numerical difference and ultimately aims at a conceptual shift. It's a conceptual shift that's at the center, and that's why I think philosophy does not only play a part in the reception, so in interpretation and critique, but already in the production of artworks. For only what could not have emerged until now within an artistic field, and that's maybe my part of institutional theory at this point, so what could not have emerged until now within an artistic field, and in accordance with the generative rules enforced there, can be considered original from an artistic point of view. Another way of speaking, and not just another phrase. It will be something that will be difficult to comprehend, something that will surprise or even surpass all those who are familiar with the generative rules in force, or who have sufficient information about contemporary art. The decisive element is a conceptual leap that elevates what is sought or what ought to be done out of its concept and opens a gap for what was hitherto excluded from a categorical point of view. With the conceptual leap, artistic processes should be analyzed as the objectified negation of their constitutive rules, norms, and conventions, of the institutions that frame them, and of the purposes that serve as a point of reference. Every minuscule negation contributes to the transformation of the concept of the artwork and ultimately of the concept of art. If art is above all oriented towards a novelty of genre, it is not because it celebrates novelty as such, but because the originary, the new genre, is singular, unique, because what is still unique today is at the same time of the future. That is why the temporal structure of artworks is decisive. The main point of orientation of artistic activity is, if I'm not mistaken, is not contemporaneity, or should not be, but initiality, inexistent inexistence and futurity. This becoming of art, which I call arting, must not only be differentiated from work, from making, from action, but also from performance and interpretation, insofar as these are strictly subject to rules, institutions, and result. Compared with the maxims of economic innovation, the radically new is the negation or metamorphosis of the constituent rules. The radically new is not a new element in a class, it is new as a conglomerate without classes. As a conceptual leap, it relates to what it stands out from, and moreover, it does so by testing new bases, rules, and modes of implementation that are non-deducible from what was known as valid before. It is in the process and not in the product that radical imagination is revealed. If we agree on these points, we may again turn to the question whether there is proprioceptive art. Which aspects of a proprioceptive practice make it an artwork? Do the examples we have of artworks involving proprioception qualify as artworks because of proprioception, or is proprioception merely also involved, but not constitutive for it being art? What would be an example for a practice that is artistic because it is based on proprioception? According to the working definition of the Proprioceptive Art project team led by Markus Schrenk, something is a proprioceptive artwork if, first, it appeals only or primarily to its recipients' proprioceptive senses, and if, second, it qualifies as an artwork. Now, these two conditions of the working hypothesis are not bound logically. It could well be that there is something that primarily appeals to proprioception, and that is an artwork, but it is not an artwork because of its proprioceptive quality. You wouldn't call something a capitalist artwork if it appeals primarily to the recipient's sense of capital, and if it is an artwork, like Damien Hirst's For the Love of God from 2007. But the connection seems to me necessary. For instance, works of visual art and works of music are such because their visuality or musicality makes them artistic. Dance, by contrast, appeals to the use of the body, but is not therefore a body art, because both figurative and conceptual qualities are by now far more important than the body work in dance. Also, the performance of a new and breathtaking composition clearly involves proprioception, so music, I mean. Composition in music clearly involves proprioception to a high degree, if not primarily, but clearly would not therefore be called a proprioceptive art. Installation art primarily involves opticality, but is clearly not an optical art. Therefore, it seems necessary for me to postulate a connection between a kind of proprioception and the qualification of it as an artwork, so that it makes sense to speak of a proprioceptive artwork. So these two need to be related, the two conditions that Markus has spelled out, it seems to me. Now, if proprioception means the perception of the body according to its position, attitude, and movement, how could such an interior perception be the core of artistic qualities and not only of aesthetic qualities? It would, of course, not mean, like in dance, the exterior perception of original ways of position, attitude, and movement, nor the aesthetic quality of this perception, which would make it an aesthetic practice, but of different modes of perception. Different in relation to what? They ought, if I'm right, they ought to test or exhibit a conceptual leap, which relates to what it stands out from. That is, proprioceptive art should be not only a more attentive or subtle or reflexive way of perceiving one's movements or positions, of perceiving one's body, but a negation of some of the rules governing this practice. A test of new modes of perception, a non-deducible from what was known as valid before. That does, of course, not mean doing a jump that no one else has done before, like Felix Baumgartner's supersonic freefall from orbit in 2012. That's also new, or radically new if you wish, but it's not a new mode of perception. Because then we would still be basing our judgment on the experimental approach. Rather, if a proprioceptive practice aims at arting, It will materialize a negation of the constitutive rules, norms, and conventions of the institutions and the purposes that frame proprioception until now, and open a radical imagination of becoming possibilities of proprioception. If we take this approach as a starting point and then go on to analyze the works of Vali Export or of Till Bödecker, we see that the sensation which is at the center has a distinct and provocative relation to the institutional and social framing of it. It is in this respect, as far as I can see, that one would have to sharpen the contrast between the setting of Till Bödecker's Isolation, which takes up the experiments by John C. Lilly, but puts them in a context of visual communication overload, of video games industry, of social distancing, of torture, but also of psychedelic art, of relational aesthetics. It is then a new possibility offered to make people discover themselves as the source of sense and imagination. If commercial floating tanks are aesthetic practices with therapeutical aim, Charles Spencer has, I think, evoked this fact that since the 60s, I think similar floating tanks have been around. But in contrast to these, Till Bödecker's Isolation uses some of these elements, but more than with his low-tech do-it-yourself setting and with the strange initiation and passage rites for art lovers he choreographs around it, he makes this an event where one exposes and shares one's inner perceptions. He exhibits a gap between the self-stimulating perceptive apparatus and the socially constituted imagination, which produces and reproduces images and words. In Vali Export's body configurations, by contrast, one easily sees that they are made to be photographed, documented, exhibited, flaring parts of feminist protest. But there is another side to it. As one work makes explicit, they are about touching from the inside. This is what mostly questions the patriarchal relationship between the street and the body, or of nature and the female body. And to use deliberate stagings and performances of the positioning of the female body to counter forceful, often patriarchic grabbing and subjection. It is not so much the body of the object of desire that now walks the streets and stares back, as one may interpret Vali Export's Tap und Tast Kino. But it is rather a communication of how it feels to give this body a sense that it is touched, a communication to herself and to other women, to other persons who otherwise could not find themselves inside their social, cultural, and sexual positioning, could not find themselves in their self. At this point, it seems to me that the works by Till Bödecker and Vali Export converge. They are about the discovery of a different self than the socially preformated one that has all the answers. They offer a political and imaginative challenge to aesthetic and physiological conceptions of what constitutes proprioception. In their most striking aspects, these works of proprioceptive art question the dominant sense of self. Thanks for listening. That's all for today.
Many thanks, Ludger. I was writing down many comments on your rich talk. This is really a lot of material to think about. Very grateful. Now the discussion is open. I have a look at the chat, and there's already a question from Eliza.
Hi, thanks for the interesting talk. So it's a question about the first part of your talk. So I think you gave us an interesting and quite persuasive theory of what counts as a good artwork, but I'm not sure that that is a theory of what should count as an artwork overall. I mean, why not admit that some artworks just aren't that good, and that those artworks that are good are the ones whose central features you have possibly described. I mean, I don't see what in principle would make it impossible for one to produce a work of design, say, that lacks those extremely creative qualities that you have stressed in the first part of your talk, and that are so relevant to the production of art. So yeah, here's the question. Thanks.
I did admit that there's some normative aspects to it in what I exposed, but still I would counter your question by another question. If you want to make philosophically a distinction between design practices and artistic practices, how would you go about it? I try to spell out criteria by which you can differentiate between the two. Of course, every designer is glad when she can call herself an artist, and they may do, just like any priest who delivers super performances at the altar may consider herself an artist. I'm fine, but if philosophically speaking, you want to draw a distinction between these practices and spell out the specificity of art and of artistic practices, I think one should come up with criteria, and I've tried to spell out what seems to me the most convincing ones. So I would guess that this kind of negation of the constitutive rules or of radical creativity, you might say, or this stressing of originality in a sense I've tried to spell out is in fact the sufficient condition for an artistic practice, to what degree ever. And then afterwards you might still try to evaluate this kind of negation as fruitful or not. So even if that is fulfilled, that doesn't mean it makes much sense or is leading anywhere. So for instance, we had a student in the Arts Academy who had for his final exhibition put fish, live fish in a sort of aquarium, but didn't feed them or care for them properly, and they died. And of course, that is something unheard of and provocative. But I wouldn't, and it's a negation of what he has been taught in the Arts Academy. But I wouldn't think that was a very fruitful contribution to art for other reasons, you know.
You have a follow-up. There's time for a follow-up, Eliza.
Thank you. Well, just to be very brief, I'm quite persuaded by the view that Dom Lopez put forward in Beyond Art in 2014. And so to put it very briefly, the idea would be, well, a lot of stuff can be art. There's a lot of really bad stuff, bad art around, and bad art is not particularly insightful. But in order for something to be art, well, it's not enough, it's not sufficient that you put it in the appropriate institutional context, if by institutional context you really mean like certain places with certain kinds of people around who pay attention to the object at issue. But what is really sufficient is that there is an appreciative practice that focuses on the aesthetic and artistic properties of the object, and that is shared by a certain community. And sometimes appreciative practices revolve around objects that aren't that great, but that's fine. There's good art and bad art. I think it is a very simple view that still allows for us to focus on those artistic practices that deserve our attention more than others, and avoid a more complicated conceptual space. But yeah, so that's my reply.
Yeah, but if you follow this approach, then you're still in a theory that makes art that what is, as to use your terminology, appreciated. So if it's appreciative practices, that transforms your Sunday painter's painting into an artwork. See, if this Sunday painter gathers around his friends, they all drink a lot of champagne and they think, "Oh, Frederick, what a great painting you have made again." This would be then an example for an artwork following Dom Lopez, and I doubt it, because of appreciation. There's 2 points with it. One, appreciation is not something that is specific for artworks. Can occur in other circumstances. Second, you still have no explanation for what the artist does, if appreciation is that what transforms something into an artwork.
I don't think there is time to continue the discussion, but I'd like to do it in another context. Thanks.
Maybe there is. Maybe there is further time. There's no question in the chat yet. I look into the into the room. Oh, there is one. Oh, there's a second one. Okay, now questions pop up. Eliza, we might come back to you later, but I would first like to ask Alexis to contribute, and then Svetlana.
Yeah, thank you. My question is about the concept of arting. And if I understood you correctly, you said that to art is not to produce something, and you're aiming at a conceptual shift in understanding artistic practices. But at the same time, you're still talking about artworks. And I don't understand how these two concepts can go together, because to me, an artwork is always the outcome of a production, traditionally understood. So do you see a friction between those two concepts?
Yes, very bright. Good remark. True, there's a friction. Because if I say art, making art is not making, it's not work, I should not use the word artwork, because it implies a work. Yeah, true. So that I admit. I should maybe also come up with another neologism for what used to be called artworks. I will work on that, thanks. Concerning arting, I think the most, the closest I get to really understanding myself is when I try to underline that arting consists in new ways of beginning. And that means that's not so much a conceptual leap in the philosophical sense. So there's something philosophical about it, but it's still a way to start. It's a way to begin. And that means there's some form of materialization involved. To come up with a new possibility means that you try to figure out what instruments and models or material you need, and in order for something to start to be realized, and for a new form of realization. So that means that some reflection and work with material is involved here, and also with the proper laws of material that then ground a new way to realize something. So finally, not the realization itself counts, but the way to realize, how to realize, the process that leads you to realize something. And that involves some form of materialization. So to give you a simple example, if you do a sketch or a model, these would be typical starting points for art. But now making a sketch or a model have already been used since centuries. And the new artistic task would be to invent something that would open up a new possibility for something to become. And this, again, involves, for this becoming, of course, involves materialization, involves more than a mere conceptual philosophical work, but some form of materialization, aestheticization, etc. So there's some form of something else than mere philosophical work involved in what I call this conceptual leap that leads to a new way of becoming, to a first step, and would be thereby also leading to traces or sketches or something that I have no name for yet, that could be also maybe watched, observed, experienced or so, but I don't know. So this is the open question, but it clearly involves something that you might call a work of art. But this work of art can, of course, be also a performance. In my book, that is the basis of this kind of reflection that I presented today. Is called Notes for a Future Art. It exists in German and in French only, unfortunately. I try to make thought experiments in the fashion that also Arthur Danto has done. And so for instance, I imagine some form of choir that mourns the end of art. And that could be something like not an artwork, but some form of arting. So for me, the process is more important than the work of art. But of course, I grant you that my talk of artworks is problematic.
Okay, Svetlana, please.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, first of all, Ludger, for your very, very clear and productive distinction, and also for the focus on the relation aspects, and also for the focusing of this moments of shiftings, because in my point of view, it's very, very important to have this in mind. What I would like to say is just like more a comment on the discussion concerning all this question of the good art you had before, because for me it was quite interesting to see that this question is so present at all in our discussions, also from today and also yesterday and the day before. Because for me it's quite not that clear, I guess, why we just discuss this category of being good at this point and in this strong sense. Because for me, and I'm coming from, on the one hand, from the media and culture studies, but from the other hand, from the art history and art science, this question of being good, what makes art good art, is very, very difficult to grasp or to understand, because for me there's a question, is it being good the question of circulation on the art market, or is it the question of I don't know, of canonization of an artwork? So I maybe just to come back to you, Ludger, for me it was very productive and very fruitful that your talk, as I understood it, didn't need that kind of normative settings and that kind of normative discussion of this aspect. And so for me, I had the impression that on several points, this question of being good, or being good art, or being good proprioceptive art was very, very strong and had a very strong presence. And for me, it's quite an open question, why or what's the fruitful, or what is a very productive switch of asking it like this and not just questioning another way around, maybe.
Well, it's clearly a problem once you talk about art, where you draw the distinctions and how you do it. And for instance, art history, my great enemy, because in art history you have a very well-funded field, much better funded than philosophy, where they deal just with anything that has some ornament on it or some symbolic meaning. So roughly speaking, you find art historians who work on chairs or wardrobes from Flanders in the 14th century, and they clearly by that don't apply a very strict concept of art. They think something with a symbolic meaning is already art. And of course there's art theories like from, say, Cassira, etc., who think that the symbolic function already is sufficient to qualify something as an artwork, just as in Dento you find that. And maybe in Dento you find a step further, some indication to where an aesthetic function supersedes the symbolic function. But still, if you follow these strands, then you cannot find any criteria to differentiate strictly between, say, a novel, a recipe, a wardrobe, a wall painting, and something that is happening in what I would call art in a stricter sense. And if you would agree with me that it makes sense to try to spell out what the specificity is of art in this stricter sense, then you cannot evade being normative at some point. Because if I'm right, then there is no overarching transhistorical concept of art that is possible. You cannot. So what I've spelled out today, of course, has tried to include some aspects that would also go for Michelangelo and Da Vinci. And yet, some aspects of their practice is just something historical that would not count for today. So for instance, if today someone paints Putin, he does not, in oil, produces a very elaborate painting of Putin in oil. I wouldn't call it art. It's clearly a painting, but not an artwork, for reasons I've tried to spell out. But these reasons I've tried to spell out clearly take a position. If it's right, my observation is right, that contemporary, philosophical stance in contemporary art is always taking part in diagonal forces that will determine what art will have become in the future. So in the future, certainly people will know which attempts or approaches would count as more fruitful, and would more clearly have spelled out what contemporary or future art would have been. But there's certainly some aspect of normativity in what I've spelled out, of what I call, what I find, say, more appropriate to the specificity of art in what happens in contemporary art than other things. I have not tried to cover every aspect of what's happening today in the art world with my concept of arting, for instance. There's other aspects that are critical to most of what's happening in contemporary art. In the book, for instance, I criticize contemporary art for doing mostly aestheticized sociology or applied art history. So reenactment is applied art history, and often enough, engaged art is applied sociology. You know, you have a video of something, a video loop of some problematic archive or so, but that doesn't make it an artwork in my sense. So there's some aspect of normativity, but I'm not afraid of that.
Good. Okay. Thank you. Benjamin has another question.
Hi, Ludger, and thanks, because I think it is a fruitful position, but I have two different things. One is a genuine question, and the first is actually a comment, because I see some consequences of your thesis that actually contradicts some of your premises or some things that you said in your talk. Because, for example, I think that by your definition, video games could be art. Video games or other things like design, also sports, could be art, because
yes, sure, could be,
because,
but not by design or video games. Neither does painting nor making a video.
Yeah, that's right.
So it's not the practice itself that constitutes its being art, but a way to deal about these materials. Okay,
yeah,
go on.
that's right.
Sorry.
But this means exactly. But this means that video games could be art, because if there is a video game that, not because it is taken into an art installation or something, but it is a video game, but it is made in a way that, in some way, is original, negates what there is, and that there are examples of this. Then it could be art. But also in sports, I'm thinking about when Fosbury completely revolutionized the way to do the high jump, because everyone did it from the front side, and he invented this way of doing it from the back side. This is a perfect example of what you said. And so
no. There I contradict. No. Sorry if I may, because it is still in the same functional framing of jumping over a bar. You see, it's the same with, my example was Felix Baumgartner. I don't know if you know this guy, I think from Austria, who jumped from the orbit in free fall. And that's, of course, the most breathtaking jump someone has ever made. But it's still the same, it has the same framing jump.
Okay.
And I would say there you needed to respect, I think this aspect I brought in was Adorno, of not knowing what it is. So when Fosbury made his flop, people said, oh, what a interesting way to jump over the bar, but they would know it's a way to jump over the bar, and they didn't think, oh, what is that? What does it do? You see, but maybe continue. Sorry if I intervened, but just not to be misunderstood.
No, okay. No, thanks, because maybe now I understand better what you wanted to say. But I come to my genuine question. So, what about art tradition? How can there be a tradition if we take as art only those who disrupt, who are pioneers? What about all that come after and in a way follow that first example and create a tradition? So the question is, what becomes of the concept of tradition in art that has always been important, and it is still important?
Yeah. The concept of tradition was sort of present in my presentation when I spoke about the constitutive rules of the art field. So of course the tradition forms these rules, and it's a long-running tradition, but it's also shorter. So for instance, in the Arts Academy, people are taught by professors who tell the students what the constitutive rules of art are today in their view. And someone may emulate and repeat these rules and paint like Katharina Grosse or like Peter Doig. But as long as she does so, the student is not an artist, but just repeating what the professors do. In Renaissance, you know, you have you have this concept of art where, which is the reason why academies of art were founded, where you think you have a certain rule, a certain set of rules, which the student must follow, and everyone who complies to these rules of production of an artwork does produce an artwork. This was the Renaissance conception of art. And that's why it's taught in the academies, and they look after the standards of production. But of course, we have separated ourselves from this, and the artists of renown from the Renaissance are also known for the little or big inventions they've made, for this other way of painting, for this other aspect, for evaluating still lives more than battles or kings or something like that. You know, the history of art is also written for these sometimes tiny little personal aspects. But often enough, in art history, it is attributed, or the accounts sum up to attributing something to a personality. Also in Goodman, for instance, you find this. And to some extent in Dento, the fact that, for instance, Picasso signed it is something else than if I sign it, or if Poussin paints it, then it is the trace of the master in a sense. But this trace of the master thing, I think, does not explain why something is to be counted amongst the artwork. So there's some very traditional aspects in my account that is the fact that I underline originality. Already Plato has attacked art for its originality. In, for instance, the Nomoi, you find that in the laws. So that there's nothing new about this. What's new about my account is the way how I spell out the novelty and the reason for this novelty. So art was always about creation, you might say, or about innovation and about originality. And I take this really to be the core, and against, say, a certain postmodernist trend to say, well, in design you have innovation too, and everything is now art. I try to highlight the very specific rules for creativity, the radical creativity that's at play in art. And this goes with not only another view on what's happening actually in this innovation, what I call the conceptual leap, but also another appreciation or another logic of the future. I haven't dealt with it here. You may read it, or I might maybe spell it out at another occasion. But so what differs my account from maybe more traditional avant-garde positions is also that that the reason for highlighting this originality or this new way of becoming is not tied to a concept of knowing the future and leading us there, as in the traditional avant-garde, but I have a different concept of the future and why it imports to art to consider the future. Of course, I cannot spell it out here, but just to make it as an answer, there's a traditional part in what I say, underlining originality, and that so to speak, includes artists and art approaches of the past. And there's some more novel part in what I try to explain, and that has to do with the new concept of the future and a new consideration of what negation means in the concept of art.
Okay, thank you. We are running out of time, but I'm so tempted to ask a question myself that I allow myself to do it. Thank you very much for making me realize that there's this because. I indeed took the two attributes, being art, being proprioceptive, as logically distinct. But bringing this because into play is extremely fruitful. Still, I think that that if something is art because it is proprioceptive, that would make it good art. But I wouldn't say that the distinction lies there, that it makes art because it is proprioceptive. But never mind. But my question on the because is still this, in order to understand it better. I somehow think that on your definition of art or arting, the innovation aspect is really the most important aspect. I still help me to see more how something is an artwork because it is visual, because it is auditory, because it is such and such, without referring to innovation, because then innovation is the motor of it being art. Could you highlight again? Could you give me an example again where something is art because it is visual, not because it is innovative in being visual, but because it's visual or because it is so and so? In order to understand the oomph of the because more.
No, I would say it's the innovative dealing with the visual that makes something an artwork.
But then it's innovation which is the factor. It's not it's just visual, okay, and it's the innovation within the visual that is doing the trick. But it's not. But it's not the visual.
It is still the visual. Otherwise, you have visual representation. You have all kinds of visual representation. But if you work within the visual and come up with a new way of making this visual play out, then this is a candidate for appreciation of something as a visual artwork. And so I want to be understood regarding proprioceptive art. You are right. You might distinguish. You may not. You may still keep your working definition and have them logically distinct or separate. And these would then form a field of candidates for appreciation of something to be a proprioceptive artwork. So they may count as making the field of something that is somehow both an artwork and proprioceptive. But in a stricter sense, what makes, when it comes to speaking about proprioceptive art, there should be artworks that are artworks because of the way they deal with proprioception. And then the next step is needed. It's not which way, is it the way that they do a different way of jumping? No, it is, if I'm right, if I take the examples we all agreed on, or at least your group agrees on, that was my last sentence. It's the way they question the dominant sense of self. So if proprioception is about the self, it's about feeling yourself, then one artistic way of dealing about this or of making proprioceptive artworks would be to question this self that is produced by or affirmed by proprioception.
Yeah.
And this way it would come out with, at least with a questioning or with a new mode of a self. So if I'm right in my interpretation of what of Wally export, there is a sort of a dialectics at play between the self of the female body, socially produced in a way, and the female body that communicates with other female bodies, this how it feels like to be this self through artworks.
I see.
And I would guess that this would be my way to go. Otherwise you have this this disconnection, and it could be just accidental that they have these two features. Being an
Sure,
and
sure, good. Yeah, thanks. That clarifies a lot. And thanks for taking up the break with my own question. Ludger, thank you very much for your talk, which is very inspiring. And thanks for the questions as well. Thank you. There is a 7 minutes break left. We start at 1:15 with Juliana's talk. Okay, see you soon.
noch nicht bitte nach so. Jetzt. Okay. Das ist nicht so gemeint, oder? Brauchen wir gar nicht. Okay. Okay. Can people on Zoom hear me? Can I get a quick indication? Till you will have to give me that indication.
Yes, can hear you.
Okay, fantastic. I have the pleasure to announce Juliane Zetschke's talk. As you know, she's part of the organizing team, and I look forward to hearing her talk today. Juliane holds a master's degree in art history, theology, and Italian philology from the Free University Berlin, and a postgraduate diploma in post-war and contemporary art from Manchester University. Since 1995, Juliane has worked for major art museums and other educational institutions, as those of us who went to Saraceno's in Orbit, you know this already, because she took charge there. And she is currently working on a master's thesis in philosophy on the topic of vision and proprioception. And she will today talk about proprioception in visual art.
Thank you, Isabel. So, I'm actually taking up some points which Barbara Montero presented yesterday, which is quite nice. But first, I'm going to introduce the topic, and I'm starting right away. So, it's generally accepted that perception is multisensory. However, the multisensory nature of vision has often been neglected or outright ignored. Nonetheless, the share of the beholder in experiences of works of art has been pointed out early. In addition, art historians and artists since the end of the 19th century have also repeatedly referred to the felt bodily involvement in encounters with works of fine art and architecture. Robert Fisher coined the term Einfühlung, literally meaning feeling into, for the bodily reactions that occur when viewing paintings, and he thereby primarily referred to the viewer's bodily reactions to the formal language of a painting. In contrast, the later English translation, empathy, was very often used to refer to the human ability to empathize with the thoughts and feelings of other people. For the following, however, Fisher's original understanding of the concept will be of particular interest. From the philosophical side, Merleau-Ponty empathically addressed the body as the central medium of all perception. Natural perception, as he puts it, opens an intersensory world. It happens with the whole body. In addition to the sense of sight, proprioception and kinesthetics do play a prominent role. Together, they describe a map of what could be called the I can. I have only to see something to know how to reach it and deal with it, even if I do not know how this happens in the nervous machine. Conversely, it's just as true that vision is attached to movement. And not only Merleau-Ponty, but also the psychologist Gibson emphasized the special unity of the motor and perceptual system. Gibson, who had a special interest in visual perception, described vision as a whole perceptual system and not simply as a sensory channel. One sees the environment not just with the eyes, in the head, on the shoulders of a body that gets about. We look at details with the eyes, but we also look around with the mobile head, and we go and look with the mobile body. Finally, the philosopher Alvar Noé points out that the role of sense of sight must not be understood according to the model of a photographic image of the world. He also stresses the point that perception is an active process, not a passive registration of sensory impressions. The close connection between the visual and motor systems was further confirmed by a major discovery in the 1990s. In the 1990s, mirror neural networks were discovered accidentally in experiments with monkeys first, but later confirmed also for humans. It could be shown that identical parts of the motor cortices fired during actual planning and execution, as well as mere observation of an action, and actually also just with imagining an action, which is interesting for concept art. Thus, representations for actions and movements of different persons are shared. Barbara Montero suggests that dancers literally experience the dance movements of others when they watch them, they proprioceive them, as she suggests. Likewise, one could say that we literally feel the twisting of knees and legs when we watch someone tripping over a tree root. But first of all, what is understood by proprioception? I presuppose a narrow definition of the term, not including other bodily senses such as balance and interoception, and I use it synonymously with kinesthesia, as it's often done. In a nutshell, the proprioceptive sense provides information about the position and movement of the body and its parts. Proprioceptive sensing occurs primarily through cumulative neural input to the central nervous system, through mechanoreceptors, which are detector mechanisms located in joints, muscles, ligaments, also skin. Central nervous system, proprioceptive signals are integrated with input from other sensory systems, such as the vestibular and visual systems, and thereby contributing to automatic movement regulation and balance. Proprioception is often differentiated between proprioceptive information and proprioceptive awareness, as Gallagher and Bermudez do, for example. According to this view, proprioceptive information is non-conscious. It contributes to movement, control, and direction. And it's often addressed as an essential component of the body schema, which, by the definition of Richie Caruthers, is the long-term, regularly updated, unconscious representation of the body's extension and posture. On the other hand, we have proprioceptive awareness, which comes in two forms, in reflective or involutive form, and in a pre-reflective form, according to Gallagher. Proprioceptive awareness provides phenomenal access to proprioceptive perceptual content. The primary function of proprioception is often referred to as guiding action, and that is certainly true. However, proprioceptive feedback as part of the body schema is certainly also essential in keeping us in constant contact with our body, or in James' words, with the good old body always there, of course also with interoceptive input. But beyond that, proprioceptive feedback is obviously also quite essential, that we can freeze movements, that we can stay in positions of rest. In this regard, it was very informative for me to know that a person suffering from deafferentation, that is, a person who from the neck downwards lost his sense of proprioception and touch, and who had almost completely lost contact with his body when his eyes were closed, for him at the beginning it was initially almost impossible to stay in a one body position or to freeze a movement. So proprioceptive feedback then is apparently essential not only for actions and movements, but equally for positions of rest. And a background proprioceptive feedback is always with us, or allowing the body to run on autopilot, so to say, for most of the time, and it rarely comes into the limelight of conscious attention. It's intuitive that we draw on our motor system when we imagine or plan actions and movements. And it's interesting that we also do so when we direct our attention to the movements and actions of others. Less self-evident and obvious, I should say, is that our motor systems can also be activated when viewing static images of actions and biological movements. And indeed, it could be shown that when we look at images of frozen movements, our brain infers and neurally maps dynamic information about their evolution. But beyond that, you guessed, the neural activity partially coincides with the neuronal activity that can be detected when we are actors ourselves, when we cut the bread ourselves, or when we kick the soccer ball ourselves. For the realm of the visual arts, it was neuroscientist Vittorio Gallesi and art historian David Friedberg who first suggested simulation activity in contemplating paintings, sculptures. This is a very nice painting by Rogier von der Weyden. They stressed the importance of mirroring processes in the viewing of works of visual art. And to this effect, looking at a picture of Eve grasping the apple can trigger motor neural processes overlapping with parts of those of planning and executing the grasping action ourselves. Most mirror neural activity is probably goal-directed. Nevertheless, not only implicit goal-oriented transitive actions are mirror neurally mapped, also intransitive actions like lip licking, for example, or spreading the hand, or lots of other simple movements, and also communicative actions are simulated. So there's much to suggest that the human mirror system not only captures the goal of an observed action, but apparently sometimes also the configuration and progression of an observed movement. Finally, not only representations of active movements and actions are simulated by the motor system, but also the traces of movements and actions can trigger simulation processes. This could be shown for handwritten letters in contrast to printed letters, but also for scribbles and for the field of the visual arts. And you will find, you know, this photography from yesterday from Barbara Montero, also for abstract expressionist works of art, and explicitly also for the cuttings, the so-called concetti spaziali of Lucio Fontana. So we've seen that actions and active movements, even if only reconstructed by their traces, are often simulated. But what about passive movements? It seems hardly plausible to me that information about passive movements is available to the observer in a completely different way. Even without seeing them as agents, I'm in contact with these bodies. I intuitively know what it's like to be in a position like this. Even if I have not been tortured or martyred myself, I do have at least a very vague idea what it means to be quartered or nailed to the cross. Perhaps less dramatically, surely everybody knows how it feels when a physiotherapist or orthopedist is moving your limbs without your self-involvement. So mirror neuron research is mainly focused on the motor component of action simulation. And the somatosensory side has often been neglected. But what does that mean? Somatic sensations are those that are related to the perception of one's own body. Somatic sensations arise from the skin, from touch, pressure, pain or cold, from the muscles, tendons and joints. And all somatic sensations start with the excitation of highly specialized sensory receptors in the appropriate tissues, i.e. the skin, muscles and joints. They are connected through chains of neurons to the somatosensory areas of the brain's cerebral cortex, above all the primary and the secondary somatosensory cortices. Finally, somatic sensations are intimately associated with movement and resistant to movement. It could be shown that not only the motor cortices develop vicarious neural activity, but that the somatosensory cortices also have close functional connections to the mirror neuron system. In this sense, it's well established that the observation of passive touch, for example, activates neural areas in the observer that are equally excited in direct experiences of being touched, which seems very plausible when we look at Rodin's Kiss, for example, but also at tortured bodies, and also perhaps less dramatically again at this detail of a painting by Ribera, Isaac and Jacob. So Kaisers describes the extended findings of mirror neuron research as expanding the mirror. Instead of being a peculiar property of individual brain regions, mirroring is a rather general principle of brain function. Although we have specialized brain areas for viewing the world, namely our visual cortex, when it comes to feeling what goes on in the other people, we do not rely on a single specific specialized brain region. Instead, we seem to recruit those brain regions we would use to experience the same state, be it an action, emotion, or a sensation. So mirror activity is a widespread principle, and indeed, it could also be shown that emotional states of others can be simulated. For strong emotions like disgust or fear, but also for pain, it could be shown that regions of the anterior insula are equally engaged when we observe facial expressions of disgust, fear, or pain on the one hand, or develop similar emotional states ourselves. For our purposes, however, of great interest is, as Gazzola and Kaisers put it, that movements and actions are not only motorically simulated, but sometimes also in a somatosensory way. Oh, sorry. Motor and somatosensory simulation are not separate processes, but seem to go hand in hand during action observation. It's likely, however, that the two forms of simulation may give us different complementary insights into the action of others. Motor simulation would be ideally suited for letting us feel the intentions of others and letting guess what they would do next. For intentions and programming the future is what our motor system is all about. Somatosensory simulation, on the other hand, would give us insights into what it would feel to act in that way. Is that object heavy to lift? Would it strain our body or feel good to do that? So from a phenomenal perspective, it's easy to understand that not only touch and pain are encoded in a somatosensory way during observation, but that also movements and actions of others are processed accordingly. So I know exactly what it means to be in a position like this. Although I've never consciously thought about it before I was preparing this presentation, and although I'm not normally doing this exercise, I always intuitively knew that the abdominal muscles and those of the thighs are worked hard during that exercise, and I can really feel it when I look at that photograph. Similarly, the movements of any sports activity can be so familiar to the trained observer in terms of muscle and joint activity that she can practically predict the muscular consequences of awkward movements while observing them, analogously to instantly knowing what it means for the muscles and joints to stumble over a tree root. Finally, the header into the water of a diver is present to the engaged observer not only with a spatial goal, the water, also not with regard to the sequence of movements, possibly also to be described as a goal, of course, double somersault, a whole twist, but also with regard to the necessary stretching and posture of the body and its parts during the course of the movement. Our brain sometimes obviously adds a somatosensory dimension to the perception of third-party actions. And in this regard, vicarious motor and somatosensory activity manifest different aspects of observed movements and actions and make them understandable accordingly. So we not only have the knowledge of the co-agent, I should say, but certainly also the knowledge of the co-proprioceptor. Admittedly, the two are difficult to keep apart because they're probably closely linked. And it has been suggested that the coupling between action and proprioception is very primitive, already present in the simplest living organisms. And also about Waterman, the deafferent patient I was talking about, it is reported that for him, at the beginning of his disease, due to the lack of proprioceptive feedback, it was not only impossible to move, but also not possible to only imagine the commands to perform the movements. Waterman did simply not know what to demand to make an arm move. Considering this, action planning seems to be closely linked to proprioception. And this might be why the sense of agency and proprioception are difficult to distinguish, since functionally and phenomenally they often seem to coincide. And finally, that is why it might be helpful to look at passive movements. When we look at paintings like these, by Ribera, by the way, we are involved not only emotionally, but also in a somatosensory way. Experimentally, it could be shown that watching an extreme stretching of the hands joints not only results in motor cortex activity, but also in the activity of the primary somatosensory cortex. Likewise, watching the stretching of other limbs, like here, certainly evokes simulation activity. Nevertheless, despite this evidence, it still remains difficult to detect or isolate proprioceptive resonance. When we see tortured, martyred bodies, it's natural to conclude that our, and this time I mean global, comprehensive empathic response is emotionally triggered. We immediately recognize terrible pain and fear of death, and so it seems obvious to attribute our empathic response to the perception of that pain and this violent emotion. For me, a very interesting question, however, is, could it possibly not be the other way around? Do we possibly mirror the dramatically winding, resistant or powerless postures of the body and thereby infer the emotional content? To answer this question, again, Barbara Montero had this picture yesterday, it might be helpful to turn to works in which bodies are shown in positions of rest, where we do not have any active or passive movement, we do not have a comparable dramatic event. Everybody knows Michelangelo's David, placed in front of the Palazzo Vecchio in Florence, the former center of secular power. And I'm asking myself how we can explain that this sovereignty, this calmness, this strength and self-confidence is so effectively expressed in this naked figure of the young man. Or how should we explain that an entire collective, that is the young Republic of Florence, could easily understand David as a claim to power and a sign of superiority, although we do have a new iconographic formula, and although the young man is not active in any way? And finally, how could it be that this naked figure alone, without any insignia of power or trophies, could be read as a clear message of erection and strength? And in answering this question, I think we are brought back to the body and its language, to the upright posture of the young man, to the interaction of muscle play and relaxation, which is presented in a perfect contrapposto. In a matter of seconds, even the contemporary viewer understands this nonchalant, casual demonstration of power. And Barbara Montero yesterday spoke of the appealing effortlessness of Renaissance art, which I find quite convincing. Now, we could argue that the cultural knowledge of David's heroism and fate, besides the spatial and temporal context of the figure, essentially determine this view. And I absolutely agree. There's no doubt that these components do play a significant role. They have a significant influence. However, the comparison with works of anonymous protagonists surely speaks for an essentially bodily reading. Ron Muick's work, whom you perhaps have met before, Ron Muick's work is famous for his hyper-realistic sculptures, most of them altered in space. Here, we have no reference at all to the social, spatial, or situational context of the scene. With Ron Muick, the viewer is thrown back onto the often naked or almost naked bodies of the protagonists. The language of their bodies alone allows the viewer to read and understand the situation. And here again, it could still be argued, although I think less convincingly, we understand the emotional situation and accordingly read the bodily posture. However, what speaks against this hypothesis is that there are works in which we immediately understand the postures, the body language, even if we cannot decipher the sitter's emotional state. When the narrative context and emotional state of the sitter are hardly or not defined at all. Take, for example, Flandrin's young man. How is the young man at the seaside? Is he enjoying the sun? Is he possibly just resting after swimming? Or is he bored? Is he indulging his thoughts? Is he depressed? Is he lovesick? Or is he utterly happy? No clue, no idea. And this young man, again by Ron Muick, is he curious? Is he joyfully waiting for a gift? Or perhaps fearfully waiting for punishment? Again, no idea. We do not know how these characters are doing emotionally. However, we know very well how it feels to be in bodily positions like this. And we certainly read and classify these percepts with our own memories and experiences. Finally, let's have a look at Van Dyck's Crowning with Thorns, which turns out to be very informative, I think. Here, the situation and emotional context are well described. Christ is surrounded by a crowd of human and animal aggressors who are threatening him. What would we expect? Pain, pain, fear, excitement, nervousness, perhaps, anger. And yet a split-second glance at Christ's body alone is enough to understand that this is a patiently enduring, calm, one might even say relaxed Christ. Obviously, we can identify body postures in the flesh. We can read and thus understand them even if the situational context clearly points into another direction. And we can probably identify and understand body postures as quickly as we identify and understand actions and active movements by means of mirror processes. We understand body postures semantically. That is, we know what it means or what it could mean to be in a particular posture. The fact that we understand the posture of a sitter, however, does not mean, as shown by Flandrin and Murik, that we are directly able to infer the emotional constitution of the protagonist. So the identification of the posture on the one hand and of the emotion on the other does not necessarily seem to coincide, even though we usually seem to associate them very quickly. So in answering the questions why we read and understand other people's postures in a matter of milliseconds, that is, why we know how it feels to be in a certain position, and secondly, why we very quickly associate body postures and emotions, research on the recognition of facial expressions might be helpful. Being in a certain posture feels a certain way, and what is true for the whole body is probably true also for just a small part of it, namely the face. When I wish to find out how wise, how stupid, how good, or how wicked is anyone, or what I thought at the moment, I fashion the expression of my face as accurately as possible in accordance with the expression of his, and wait to see what thoughts or sentiments arise in my mind or heart, as if to match or correspond with the expression. These words by Edgar Allan Poe correspond to what has been told about the painter Kokoschka. Kokoschka is said to have imitated the physiognomy of his models in order to better understand them and adequately capture them in his paintings. So, following Kokoschka and Poe in a way, sensory motor simulation models for facial expression recognition have been presented. According to Wood, visual recognition of another person's facial expression reliably activates the motor and somatosensory cortices alongside the visual cortices, and thereby evidencing once again the important link between perception and sensory motor simulation. Observers of a facial expression of emotion automatically recreate it, covertly, partially, or completely. We refer to this as sensory motor simulation to highlight the fact that the perceptual process involves activity in somatosensory and motor systems largely overlapping with those that support the production of the same facial expression. Simulation sometimes, but not always, results in facial muscle activity in the perceiver called facial mimicry. So with Kokoschka and Poe, they deliberately did that to put themselves in their model's shoes, one could say. According to Wood, sensory motor simulation of facial expression is normally automatic and presumably non-conscious. Poe and Kokoschka, again, in contrast, consciously challenged these processes. It is modulated by the perceiver's social context and motivational state, and I would like to add, which is probably true for a lot of simulation activity in general. Barbara Montero, therefore, is agreed when she writes, "Why is the Mona Lisa smile so captivating? Certainly it's visually captivating, but I suggest it's also proprioceptively captivating. When we observe the smile, we feel what it's like to smile in that way. And if this is correct, there seems to be no reason to claim that visual experience is necessarily more fundamental than proprioceptive experiences. Rather, the visual and proprioceptive work hand in hand." Needless to say that sensory motor simulation models for facial recognition sometimes do play an important role in emotion theories, in simulation theories of emotion recognition. The idea, in short, is that coming to know what another person emotionally feels consists in simulating in the brain the motor plans and associated sensory representations that supposedly elicited the observed facial expression. Recently, an extension of the simulation model has been advocated for, and you're not surprised, not only facial expressions, but the expressions of the body as a whole are important expressive channels for providing cues to another person's emotional state. So both, according to this view, are regularly taking place, and both should play a major role in emotion recognition. In addition to this, finally, body state simulation has been suggested, that is, simulating changes in the observed person's internal bodily states, meaning changes in the autonomic nervous system and viscera, for example, an accelerated heartbeat of someone else, and an idea which was prominently advanced by Antonio Damasio. But what finally is important here is that a crucial role in emotion recognition is proposed for both proprioceptive and interoceptive processes. Are we proprioceiving when we look at a work of art? Yes, there is much to suggest that we are co-proprioceiver. Mirroring processes have been empirically proved, not only for the motor system, but also for the somatosensory system during action and movement observation. But what does that actually mean? Galesi describes the underlying simulation mechanisms of mirror processes as direct, automatic, non-predicative, and non-inferential. Mirror mechanisms grant direct access to the meaning of other people's behavior, where conscious introspective access is not necessarily required. Thus, we could say we are proprioceiver behind the scenes. But that does not mean right away that we necessarily have to be aware of these processes, that we have phenomenal access to them. Mirror activity probably does not occur consciously for the most part. Nevertheless, it can cross the threshold of consciousness by the salience of a stimulus. You all know that. I can suddenly become aware of the pain of somebody else, or can suddenly become aware of the muscle and joint experiences of another person, so watching someone stumbling over the tree root, for example. Awareness of mirror activity obviously depends on the salience of a stimulus and probably on the degree of attention, which in turn depends on top-down processes such as memory, knowledge, interest, motivation, emotional state, and so on. And it's well conceivable that mirror activity often feeds into pre-reflective awareness. Think of Muir or Flandrin again, these young men. I think we are often phenomenally aware of how it feels to be in a particular position or posture or movement, but we do not have to be explicitly aware of it. So now a question, is there an awareness beyond this non-conscious or pre-reflective givenness? Could we say that we can consciously, proprioceptively feel the body movements or actions of others, as Motero suggests? That, as she writes, quote, in becoming aware of these representations, we in some sense proprioceptive the dancer's movements. And I should say yes. Apart from the empirical evidence that the somatosensory cortex is more involved in action and movement processing than probably originally thought, also the phenomenal perspective clearly points in this direction. When we watch or hear movements that are particularly familiar to us, that stand out or are meaningful in some way, and to which we also direct our attention, as it happens, by the way, paradigmatically in museums or stadiums or then theaters, then we often have the impression of formally undergoing them. And this experience is well comparable to other simulation experiences. For example, in touch, it's easy to understand. When I observe someone being touched, for example, by styrofoam. Styrofoam is a material very unpleasant to many of us. And then watching this being touched can make me feel as if I myself have been touched with this uncomfortable material. So I think the as if is the essential part. What is phenomenally going on here can well be described as an as-if experience. Watching someone else being touched or move in a specific way may consciously feel as if I myself have been touched or moved in a specific way. So functionally and phenomenally conscious perceptions involving mirror processes can be aptly described this way. It may feel like for the dancer as if she has executed the movements herself, or it may feel like for the Rodin admirer as if she has been touched herself. And to this effect, dancers do not perceive the movements on stage in a way that they would actually fully feel their legs, arms, and bodies moving. Instead, they perceive the movements on stage as if they were dancing themselves. And often enough, we describe such experiences with words like, I can literally feel the movement, or I can literally feel the touch. And this literally does not even correspond to a deception. The neural underpinnings, in a way, prove this statement right. Simulation mechanisms are a very good explanation for why I can have a very lively feeling, a very lively idea of something, and yet at the same time know perfectly well that I'm not living it, actually, which sounds paradoxical, not experiencing it. Needless to say that this is why literature, but lots of other entertainment, film, cinema, can be so successful. Visiting a museum or dance theater, when I observe actions or the pictorial representations which are of fundamental importance to me, encounters with art can become a genuine self-experience through this kind of reenactment. And in these moments, the boundaries between self and simulacrum can get neglected for once. And I think in this respect, our saying that good art can actually be touching is once again very instructive. So coming back one last time to Einfühlung or empathy. Both Laocoon, two versions of a Laocoon. The automatic, often non-conscious processes play a significant role in our access to works of visual art. Direct access to the actions and movement of others is given without the need for explicit propositional attitudes. Galesi aptly speaks of intercorporeality. We track the intentions of others through our shared circuits. And it's already with these subliminal perceptual processes, or rather with predictions about them, that we are interpreting the world and its art. And this interpretation clearly precedes the business of the art critique or the art historian. But beyond Galesi, we probably not only detect the intentions of others in their movements and actions, we also often detect the accompanying bodily sensations. We not only understand the goal of an action, we also often understand the somatic intent and sensation associated with that action. So there's much to suggest that we often map the proprioceptive and presumably interoceptive facets of actions, movements, and postures. And this explains why many of us, while watching, immediately understand what's going on when people perform a certain gymnastic exercise or posture, and why we can semantically classify postures in a flash without even any contextual information. However, I think that's important to note that simulation of salient actions, movements, and postures does not automatically trigger empathy in an emotional sense, as it has sometimes been suggested. Numerous battle scenes in museums, for example, or even Warhol's disaster paintings, a good example, can leave us totally cold. Nonetheless, it's reasonable to assume that such pictures do trigger simulation processes, but that these are rather to be qualified as sensorimotor Einfühlung or sensorimotor empathy. That instead of empathy, we should perhaps speak less misleadingly of bodily resonance in this context. Finally, with Galesi, it is to be presumed that, quote, the functional architecture of embodied simulation is the basis of our capacity to empathize with others. Empathy can be conceived of as the consequence of our natural tendency to experience interpersonal relations first and foremost at the implicit level of intercorporeality. So, coming to a conclusion now. Vision is a multimodal operation that involves activation of the motor, the somatosensory, and the visceral sensory system. In researching the fundamentals and mechanisms of visual perception, the visual arts offer themselves as a very good laboratory situation. When we look at works of art, we are physically, that is, bodily, in much more direct contact with them that we might want to acknowledge. We encounter works of art with our whole body and certainly not only with our eyes. We encounter works of art with the exteroceptive senses, but also presumably quite decisively with the so-called bodily senses, with proprioception and interoception. And in addition, we obviously encounter works of art with our knowledge of the world, which we have acquired through our bodies. So the riddle of the liveliness of pictures can well be explained with reference to simulation mechanisms. In pictures and sculptures, frozen actions and movements are not materially reproduced. No, the viewer often reenacts the action or movement. The beholder's share then is not only in the transformation of a two-dimensional into a three-dimensional image, also not in top-down processing with memory and knowledge. No, the beholder's share is also given by his property as a co-agent, as a co-properceiver, and as co-toucher. And in this sense, the liveliness of the image is rooted in the bodily nature of the beholder. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Juliana. We now have till 4:15 for questions and comments. Okay, you might, it seems like this time the chat is a little slow. So, okay, I would have had a question otherwise, but I'm giving the floor to Marcus here.
Okay, yeah, thanks. Thanks, Juliana. I don't have a question because, first of all, everything was so clearly set out, and also it is amazingly informative for the project, and shows us very much that in visual art a lot of proprioception is going on. So I really don't have a question because everything is so clear. One thing would be, I said that we can cross-categorize, of course, works of art. They can be many things. They can be visual arts and auditory arts and proprioceptive arts at the same time. And all the examples you have given and the pictures you have shown would, by my definition, of course, be visual arts, but also proprioceptive art. But I would still think, or it makes me realize that although cross categorizations are possible, or multiple categorizations are possible, there is somehow the dominant or the direct perception is still the one by which we tend to categorize. So although it is perfectly clear from what you have said and argued that Laocoon, say, is a proprioceptive artwork, we would still say it's predominantly visual. We would not. Our first reaction, I guess, wouldn't be to say, "Oh wow, here's another proprioceptive artwork," but it would be rather, or we would maybe rather categorize it not by the sense perception, but by saying that it is a sculpture. So all I'm saying is, although definitely almost every visual art involves proprioception, it's only secondarily so that we would classify it as such. But it is very important to highlight the proprioceptive aspects of it, which is very much part and essential of the artwork. Sorry, that was just a commentary, not really a question. Sorry to interrupt. It's very hard to hear you, at least for us participating via Zoom. Yeah, it's a lot better. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, thanks.
Focus. Do we therefore also take something away from the visual art?
We cannot shift from proprioceptive information to proprioceptive awareness because, as far as I understand it, we do not have access to proprioceptive information. It's something, and there are different neural pathways. The pathway for the awareness of proprioceptive input, and the other one, and so we don't have any access. As far as I understood that, not being a neuroscientist, but we do not have access to proprioceptive information. It's really running behind the scenes. Does that explain?
Yeah, that at least sums up that position. And then you wanted to see proprioception in the narrow sense, so you take away the balance and you just reduce it to positionality and movement. And I thought, given this narrow sense, then where would be the kind of difference between the artwork of the plank, which we looked at, and between Saraceno's net? Because if we just see them hypothetically as artworks that try to, for example, give the maybe illusion or just feeling of, for example, being high up and be giving rise to the action of stepping over the edge, kind of, then there wouldn't be much of a difference between those two with the narrow sense.
Yeah, I mean, I was discussing with members of the workshop here. I thought that, for example, in Orbit, Saraceno, not the proprioceptive sense in a narrow sense is involved so much, or the pleasure does not come from the proprioceptive sense in a narrow sense, but perhaps much more from the sense of balance, because what is really nice in Saraceno's work is try to find your way, your movement through the installation. So this for Saraceno, I haven't experienced the plank. I mean, is the plank wobbly? Does it? Not really. So
I mean, I guess if we were to imagine Saraceno's net like directly over the ground, it would be less of an experience. That's just what I would imagine. Like just like half of a meter above the ground, then you wouldn't get this the same vertigo as you would. So then again, you would get the proprioceptive experience, which adds so much to it by your visual.
Exactly. Yeah.
System. Yeah.
Absolutely.
And then there wouldn't be a difference.
Yeah, and Gibson, I think it was Gibson who speaks of visual proprioception. When we consciously proprioceptive, very often the visual element comes in, and it definitely generates lots of illusions as well, because, as I said, two different pathways, and the conscious proprioception very often comes together with vision. Yeah.
Actually, I have the chance to comment too. So I do only have a comment, not a question, or just something that sprang to my mind during your talk. And you were building on, first of all, the aspect of mirror neurons for emotions, but then also with the caveat that those might not be conscious, but we do have emotional responses to pictures. But one thought that I had when you were talking about was that often it's not that we have the emotion that is depicted in a picture, but we have an opposite emotion. So sometimes if you have like an aggressive face shown and you understand, okay, that's aggression, but you feel maybe fear, or maybe not fear, maybe disgust, because you're like, why is this person so raging? Yeah. And I was wondering whether that is, I mean, you're already nodding, so I think you already have something to say to that, but I was wondering whether maybe, so I'm turning it into a question now, whether maybe this differences in, or maybe we call it then disrepresentation, could happen with the bodily sensations too.
I'm not a neuroscientist, but all I understand is that the one thing, that's why I've thought it's a very important point to separate sensory motor empathy from emotional empathy. And that's why it was for me such an important point to make that clear, that the two don't go together, because it's exactly what you say. What happens when you look at paintings, there might be someone crying and being really sad, but it's not touching you, it's not, I mean, you sensory motorically you do simulate the process, but it's not emotionally triggering any responses in you.
Or a different response even.
Or different responses, exactly. And I'm not, I mean, emotions, now we're coming to James, and James has been quoted yesterday quite often. Emotions probably, I mean, I think that's very plausible, they do have they have a lot to do with your interoceptive reaction. So your interoceptive reaction to a painting can decisively influence how you emotion. Perhaps the interoceptive is the emotional, I'm not 100% sure, but the interoceptive reaction to a painting will definitely trigger your, or will take part in triggering your emotional response to the painting, which is something different than the sensory motor simulation of the person's postures which are depicted. Mm-hmm. Did you get it? Did you?
I think it was helpful for me. Okay. Yes, thank you.
Yeah.
We do still have time for further questions. However, in the room I don't see anyone indicating any, and I will give the chat another moment. Corinna, would you like to say out loud? You can just comment, you don't have to have a question.
Yeah, I just wanted to share this paper where they exactly try to disentangle the motor form of embodiment or motor simulation and then the emotional simulation. There's also more, I think they cite other studies that try to disentangle these two aspects. It's quite a recent paper from 2021. Yeah.
Okay, I think that will be fun to check out.
Okay.
Okay, well, if there are no further questions, I would say let's thank our speaker again, and we will reconvene at 12:30 6:30 with Corinna's talk.
Thank you.
Okay, okay.
Ja. Ja. Moment.
Okay, fine. So I have the pleasure to introduce Corinna Kühnapfel. Corinna Kühnapfel is a PhD candidate in the artist project at the University of Vienna. She has a background in cognitive science and embodied cognition with a focus on empirical aesthetics and neuroaesthetics. In her PhD, she investigates the role of the body in the experience of art by considering physical engagement, movement patterns, and interoception. She's particularly interested in the special modes of bodily engagement offered by installation art and how these create conditions for engaged, insightful, and self-reflective experiences. Today, Corinna focuses for us here on the role that empirical aesthetics can play in deepening our understanding of the role proprioception may play in art reception. The stage is yours, Corinna. Thank you.
Can you see my mouse on the shared screen?
Yes.
Perfect. Yeah, thank you for the introduction and also the invitation to speak at this workshop. As was said, I come from psychology, more specifically empirical aesthetics, so not philosophy, and I hope that I can contribute to the topic of this workshop from this perspective. And my talk will not be so much about the definition of art, but the experience of art. And just a few words on the project that my PhD is part of, namely the ARTIST project. ARTIST is short for Art and Research on Transformations of Individuals in Societies. It's an EU project which has the main research question whether art engagement can sometimes lead to intense and transformative experiences, and if yes, by which mechanisms. It has also the aim to systematically assess the modes of engaging, including the body and impacts from art. And this project originated with the question on basically why are people drawn to art? Why do a lot of people go to art museums? why are there so many museums? So there must be something to it. So in short, why do we care about art? And maybe because it offers us very special and emotional experiences and engagements. So here are some artworks that have been described to cause very intense and even transformative experiences. For example, many people who took part in Marina Abramovich's performance called "The Artist is Present" at the MoMA started to cry, or these very claustrophobic bodily experiences in Bruce Naumann's corridor. Or also sometimes art is used to promote change, such as with this installation by Olafur Eliasson, consisting of melting ice blocks in a circle in front of the Tate that was supposed to raise awareness on climate change. Yeah, as was mentioned, my PhD topic is the role of the body in art experience. And before I will look at the body, I will look at the brain and introduce you to the field of neuroaesthetics, where I'm coming from, and thereby I'll also tell you about two forms of embodiment. And with this, I want to show you that the role of the body in art experience has been overlooked in empirical aesthetics research. And then I will tell you about my empirical studies. I chose a study on movement, and then installation art, which has not been studied yet with regards to the body. And I will tell you why this art form is so interesting with regards to the body. And then I'll come to the empirical study that is currently ongoing with Thomas Saraceno's installation artwork in Orbit. Some of you experienced it on Wednesday. So as I said, before I look at the body, I want to look at the brain. So neuroaesthetics is a relatively new branch of neuroscience, which explores the neural processes underlying aesthetic experience and judgment. So put simpler, how does the brain respond to art? And just to give you an idea of one of the first studies that was conducted in this field in 2004, this was an fMRI studies, and subjects were in the scanner and viewed paintings, portrait, landscape, still life, or abstract paintings, and they had to classify them as beautiful, neutral, or ugly. And what was found that beautiful paintings showed increased activity in the medial orbital frontal cortex. That is an area involved in emotion and reward processing. It's here in the frontal lobe of the brain. Yeah, so this should give you an idea how experiments in neuroaesthetics are conducted. And yeah, ever since this field came alive, and besides regions related to emotion and reward processing, like the medial frontal cortex here again in red that I mentioned, with the research up to date, we know that also areas connected to the sensory motor areas here in yellow are involved in aesthetic experience. So for example, areas that are involved in the basic processing of visual attributes, so color, form, contrast, but also the fusiform gyrus, which is associated when we see faces in, for example, representational art, or the parahippocampal gyrus, which is associated with the recognition of environment or places depicted in art. And then we have knowledge meaning centers in blue. These involve top-down influencing factors, so previous knowledge about the art or expertise. And these are involved when forming judgment about the art and giving meaning to the experience. Yeah, and so in summary, from neuroaesthetic studies, we know that aesthetic experiences engages a distributed set of structures in the brain and likely emerges from the interaction of these core neural systems, so meaning, knowledge, sensory motor, and emotion evaluation. And this has also been called the aesthetic triad of processing components. And one network that I would like to draw attention on is the motor system, which brings us a bit closer to the topic of the workshop, which is proprioception. Very simple image of where the motor cortex lies in the brain. And you might have heard about mirror neurons before. Now, in the following, I will refer to a lot of what Juliane Zatschka has just presented in her talk. But I will go over it again in case someone did not see the previous talk, and also because this research is interesting and relevant for the workshop topic. And in a few slides, I will show you why I included it in my talk and where I want to get at with this. Yeah, mirror neurons were first observed in macaque monkeys and are responsible for the action of one's own body and also when observing the actions of another person. So the mirror neurons in this monkey's brain fire when the monkey picks up the banana, and they also fire when the monkey sees someone else pick up the banana. So the action on the right side is not produced but simulated. And mirror neurons, or the mirror neurons mechanism is also responsible for being able to empathize with other people. So for example, if you accidentally see someone cut themselves, we can simulate what this must have felt based on our own experience. Now back to art. Super interestingly, motor areas are also active when viewing static images of actions. So in the absence of actual movement. And the theory here is that our brain simulates the movements depicted in these paintings by means of the mirror neurons. So for example, these hand or arm gestures, and this is called embodied simulation. And such activity in the motor cortex was also found for viewing images or photographs of sculpture. And the authors concluded that it's likely that this activation here in the motor cortex comes from the sense of action that the sculpture evokes in the observer. Yeah, and interestingly, the motor system is not only active when we see actions depicted in the content of the painting, but also abstract art. So when there's no content, so by means of the embodied simulation mechanism, we simulate the brush strokes, so the artist's goal-directed movements, as if we would make the same gestures. And this was assessed by comparing brain activity of participants when viewing paintings on the left. So the original paintings compared to these graphically modified paintings on the right, where you cannot infer the brush strokes anymore. Yeah, and because the study found more brain activity in the motor system for the original artworks, these results support the role of embodied simulation of the artist's gestures in the perception of artworks. Also another study looked at these cuts in canvas by Lucio Fontana, and they also found more activity over the motor areas for the original artworks. Here in blue. And there's also research on dance that we've already seen in the last days, on dance and embodied simulation, which found that we internally simulate the body movements of dancers as if we perform a movement ourselves. And on top of that, there's also the finding that there's stronger activity in motor areas. So here, when participants liked the dance, here the smiling face compared to when they liked it less. There's also an effect of expertise in dance, so more activity in this action observation network when being familiar with the dance or having training in dance. That was mentioned by Barbara Montero yesterday, but I will not go into expertise in this presentation, just to make you aware that this research exists. So to summarize, embodied simulation is the simulation of the actions depicted in art or the gestures captured in art by means of the mirror neuron system. So the mirror neuron system was described as a mechanism to resonate with the content and also the compositional aspects of the artwork. And I showed this for representational art and abstract art and dance. Also, there's a wide discussion on whether this contributes to the formation of aesthetic experience or art evaluation. But for this presentation, I will only focus on what that this is part of looking at art, so that it's part of art perception. Okay, so anyways, so this form of embodiment only happens in the brain, and this is important. Mouse. Yeah, and from the representation of the body and the movement and actions in the brain, I would like to get to the actual movements we make when we experience art. Yeah, and these two aspects of embodiment have also been described as weak embodiment, so embodiment that focuses on motor processing and embodied simulation in the brain, but also on the other hand, strong embodiment, which refers to the actual body movements themselves. And on the first day of this workshop, Markus Schrenk raised the notion of indirect and direct proprioception, and that the mirror neurons, or also, for example, eye movements, could be classified as indirect embodiment, indirect proprioception. So maybe there are similarities of what you meant with weak embodiment and indirect proprioception, and then strong embodiment and more direct proprioception. And yeah, when we look at these pictures, at the bottom, you can already see a gap to where studies in empirical aesthetics are usually conducted versus where art is usually experienced. So in the lab versus the museum. And in the lab, you of course have more control, where it's difficult to control for factors that could influence the art experience, like other people in the museum. And this gap has been started to become recognized and in empirical aesthetics, and even more studies are conducted in these so-called ecologically valid settings, that is, settings which are the real museum or gallery, or at least resemble that. And one aspect regarding the way the body is engaged in art experience in an ecologically valid setting is movement that I would like to expand on a bit more. But first, why is it interesting to look at strong embodiment and movement? Why is that interesting for art experience? As I mentioned, there's a shift in empirical aesthetics to move studies from the lab into more ecologically valid settings, because a lot of studies showed that context plays a role in the experience of art. And one aspect of the ecologically valid context is embodied engagement, and for example, terms of movement. And this is under considered in empirical aesthetics research, possibly due to a lack of methods on how to even assess movement. And actually, embodied cognition claims that the experience is based on having a body and the way we move our body in the environment. Based on this, we have the hypothesis that art experience might be related to how we move during it. So we did a study on how do we move in front of a single artwork and how does this relate to art experience, looking at strong embodiment. This has never been done before, so we developed a new paradigm. So in this experiment, we placed one abstract artwork in this gallery room. The artwork that was chosen for the study was a high quality reproduction of an abstract oil painting titled Kämpfende Formen. We chose it because it had this balanced composition and was generally uniform in terms of, for example, visual complexity. And then we tracked participants' movements with 2 movement trackers that we placed in the corners of the room. They worked with infrared cameras, and they were in this wooden box in the corners of the room. We did not tell the participants that the movement was tracked. So participants were not aware that the movement was tracked. And I think some of them thought that the boxes and the corners were speakers or something. And this is the floor plan of this ecologically valid gallery setting, what it looked like. So participants entered the hallway where the artwork was hung here on the top. And then this was this gallery space. And yeah, in addition, we combined this with mobile eye tracking. So participants wore mobile eye tracking glasses. So mobile eye tracking allows us to examine the viewing patterns from the point of view of an individual in action. No, we can't find my mouse. So using this method, we could record where participants looked at on the artwork while they were moving, for example, here. And you can already see in this figure where they looked at. So we used a heat map overlaid on the artwork as a method to show where participants looked at the artwork. Mean viewing time was approximately 3 minutes. And the numbers in the grid represent the relative amount of fixations that landed in each grid cell. And as you can see, most of the fixations, so a total of 25%, landed in the center 3 cells, and only 3.4% of the fixations were outside the artwork. And we also found relatively more fixation at the top 2 rows than the bottom rows. And we also found a general or typical pattern of how participants moved. So here you can see the floor plan. with the artwork at the top, and the blue dotted lines represent the mean of the X standing position, here X standing and Y standing position. They kept a visual angle of almost 90 degrees, and you can say that they stayed in the center, and then they don't get super close. They kept a distance of 0.5 meter. And here we plotted each participant's trajectory and overlaid them. We had 39 participants, and you can see this T-shape. So participants moved along the Y-axis, and then from the left to the right when they were closer to the artwork. And here you can see all trajectories individually, so not overlaid. So again, the floor plan from above. So this is where the artwork was. For example, this participant started on the right side at the back, and then went to the left, and then in front of the artwork went to the right, and then back again to the left corner. Or this one went to the front, then back again, and then to the front again, and then back again. Again, all 39 trajectories overlaid on top of each other. And then we wanted to see whether we can find shared patterns between participants. So I classified each participant's trajectory into groups using a set of metrics. For example, the straightness of the trajectory, the step length, the mean standing positions on the Y or X axis, the trajectory length, and the duration it took to complete the trajectory. And here you can see the 4 resulting clusters, and the trajectories that fell into each group are overlaid. And next, we related these patterns to the art experience. I didn't mention that before, but after each participant spent as much time as they wanted in the room, we gave them a questionnaire to ask them about the experience. For the art experience, we, for example, asked how aware they were about the approach to the artwork, whether they thought the art was dynamic, whether they felt stimulated, emotionally aroused, positive emotion, or insight. And just to give you an example of how to connect the body to the experience, I would like to look at insight. So participants in cluster 2 in green, they didn't move so much, and they stayed at the distance from the artwork, and they reported a lesser insightful experience because this green bar is lower than the others, than participants in, for example, cluster 4, which really moved a lot. And I know that they also spent the longest time in the room. And as an additional measure beyond the actual movement, so the objective movement tracking, it's also important to consider the subjective experience of one's body during art engagement, because at least based on theoretical discussions, it can be argued that subjective aspects such as the awareness of the immediacy and physical presence of the art, oneself and the environment, are aspects of experiencing art. So we asked whether they felt that the room influenced their encounter, whether they were aware of their movement, of their approach, or the standing distance. And you can see in this figure that participants are generally aware of the room and their movement, the approach to the artwork, and the viewing distance, because the means are above the midpoint, which was 4. And just some more appraisals that we collected. And you can see that feeling stimulated, positive emotion, and body awareness had the highest ratings. So interestingly, participants are aware of their body while viewing art in the gallery. So this study was the first very exploratory attempt to see how we move relates to art experience. And also this study is with visual art, which is also the primary art form used in empirical aesthetics research. But an art form that has been under-considered in empirical aesthetics is installation art, maybe because it engages the bodily and proprioceptive experiences in a more specific way, which I will get into in the following slides. And by this, we're getting closer to the workshop topic and my study on Thomas Saraceno's work. In the following, I want to make clear why this art form is so special and interesting to me and relevant for today. So in the art historical literature, installation art has been widely noted to evoke and require use of the body in terms of participation. So the dependence of installation art on the spectators has been reflected since the early 60s under the notion of the inclusion of the viewer. So the participatory audience expects to play a significant part in the completion of the work and its reception. So the participant is part of the experience, and so is the experience part of the artwork. And in this way, installation art is often relational, where emphasis is placed on the role of the visitor in the realization and the reception of the artwork. Where's my mouse? Here. And the next characteristic is on the way the body is engaged in installation art. So especially compared to paintings, which can be grasped more instantaneously, the often larger scale of installation artworks require physical activity, active exploration, spatial movement, and also time is required to be able to fully explore a larger work of art rather than a smaller piece. And third, installation art is often intended to activate the body, so to increase awareness of one's body and bodily presence and cause bodily experiences. And here I have a few examples of more installation art pieces that address the body in various ways. And we have seen some of the following examples in this workshop before. So this bouncy castle was presented as a trigger for the vestibular system. Yeah, and also in this piece, it becomes clear that the visitor becomes a participant and arouses their body by jumping on this bouncy castle. Another example, although it is a painting, it is distributed across the room and you can actually walk on the painting. Here you can see one of James Turrell's light and space installations where visitors reported bodily experiences like weightlessness or floating, because there was no clear distinction between the floor and the ceiling and the depth anymore. Or this tape structure where you can crawl through, and at the same time, when you're below, you can watch the other visitors move above you. Here you can see an installation by Anne Hamilton, and this fabric here actually moved up and down, and at some point visitors started to lay down below and watched the fabric move above them. And this interaction wasn't actually intended by the artist, but I can imagine that it looked very beautiful to watch the fabric moving above you. And probably once one person started, others just joined. And this installation was intended to lift up a single visitor at the time to play with the sense of gravity. And now I finally come to the installation artwork for my study. Some of you have experienced it. I will focus on it a bit more, and I chose this artwork because it addresses all these characteristics that I mentioned before, like participation, movement, and bodily experience. To those who weren't there, there's a video. So it's this 3-layered set that you can enter. You could all see the video. Just a bit of background. This installation is inspired by spider nets and also part of Thomas Saraceno's cloud structures, in which he addresses the concept of utopia and living in the clouds. And so I said I chose this installation because it very nicely picks up some of the characteristics I mentioned before. So for example, participation, which was also intended by the artist, who said that the audience is important, they make the piece, and also if there's no person in the work, there is no work, it is invisible. Without the people in the work, there's nothing to see almost. So spectators become performers vital to the successful execution of the work. And another interesting aspect that a lot of the experiences I found in the internet, in interviews and articles, but also from my own experience, are related to the body. I collected these testimonies before I started collecting data for my study. So I want to have a look at the phenomenology of this installation with focus on the bodily experiences. Many reported feeling their body balance or weightlessness, their core stability, their heart pounding, their breathing. Someone said that they felt the net under their fingers while crawling. Someone experienced the themes of falling, floating, and flight. Someone said, as I left the net hanging in the sky, I felt overwhelmed by my own weight on the concrete ground. Someone read this work as a performance event, focusing on the role of the spectator's body. And so anecdotally, and also from my own experience, this installation artwork especially does something to the body. However, in neuroaesthetics and empirical aesthetics, this has never been empirically assessed. So this leads me to the first research question for my study. So what kind of experiences do people have on the bodily level, and can we empirically capture that? How I started to assess this was with the qualitative part, where participants were invited to reflect on the experience of their body during the experience, and then to describe briefly in their own words what this was like or any notable aspects. And then I employed 29 items that looked at aspects to the body. For example, an awareness of the body, and participants here could rate how much they made this experience on a Likert scale, ranging from 1 to 7, so 1 not at all and 7 extremely. Or also items looked at the heartbeat, balance, gravity, movement of other visitors, a sense of being watched, and more. And in addition to the body, psychologically, this artwork is very interesting because it has been noted to evoke intense emotions. So the artist said that many reported emotions to him like trust, hesitation, joy, fear, happiness, uncertainty. Thank you, Juliane Zetschke, for sending me this text, but also fear and desire and emotions about life and death, thrill and fear. So altogether the experience can be thrilling, existential, that tests emotional and physical limits. And also the curator noted that rarely does a work of art involve the viewer so directly emotionally. Also, I found this one that I found interesting, where visitors sat down on the net for a moment and described, I realized that I have never had an aesthetic experience quite like this one before. And in order to capture the emotional experience in the survey, I used this Geneva emotion wheel consisting of 16 different emotions, and also some other emotions that were found in the interviews I presented before. And for example, wonder, which is argued to be a prototypical aesthetic emotion. And these were also listed with Likert scales, so participants could rate how much they experienced the emotions. And besides all these emotions, the artist wanted to make people more sensitive to the installation, other people, or even the weather, and said, who knows, maybe this sensitivity will lead to more peace. And he was interested in how this installation generates new ideas. And so the installation gives the opportunity to perceive the world from new heights and vantage points. So this change in the environment triggers thought processes, self-perception, perspective change. So there's a lot of, or some reflection or even change or transformation happening, and that the installation art allows the viewer to discover new things or new things about themselves. And here we also have the bridge to the artist project. And keeping in mind that this installation artwork maybe induces these self-reflective experiences that some people have already reported in the internet, there's a good deal of literature that suggests that body awareness may play a role in self-reflective art experiences. And in psychological models of art experience, the body has been noted as a trigger to induce reflection on the self, so that awareness of one's body facilitates a switch to an inward reflected mode. So the body is seen as a modality for self-reflection. And I can also see that there's a connection to day 2 of this workshop, where Ksenia Fedorova also noted in her lecture that proprioception could be a method for thinking. And this leads me to the second research question I have, whether high awareness of the body relates to more self-reflective experiences. How we try to capture self-reflection or change based on these items that appeared in this psychological model of art experience by Matthew Pawlowski. So for example, self-awareness, experiencing something novel, insightful, profound, transformation, anxiety, confusion, awe. Yeah. And on to the next research question. So to recap, it's interesting to me that the experience of installation art is not mainly based on the object and its visual attributes, but also on the experience of one's own body, proprioception, and kinesthetics. And this is also grounded in the philosophical theory, okay, a bit of philosophy here, of pragmatist aesthetics, which recognizes the body as the experiential core of action and perception. And on top of that, according to the embodied aesthetics thesis by Barbara Montero, one can have an aesthetic experience of one's own body as perceived through the senses other than vision and audition. So in other words, proprioception is an aesthetic sense. One can make aesthetic judgments based on proprioceptive experience. So the idea here is that proprioception may play an aesthetically relevant role in the experience of the receiver of art. This has also been found in some aesthetics, which foregrounds the role of bodily experience in aesthetic appreciation. So I wonder whether participants enjoy the bodily experience they're having and how much the bodily experience relates to other factors of the art experience, such as emotion. These ideas are further evaluated, not with installation art, but here on the experience of architecture, where Schusterman wrote, if the appreciation of architecture is so strongly linked to somatic experiences, such as proprioception, then heightening somatic consciousness could improve our architectural experience. Interestingly, I found a similar theoretical idea for watching and performing dance. So Montero wrote, it is likely that much of the proprioceptive information we receive about the movements of others and even ourselves is below the level of conscious awareness. But by shifting our awareness to the proprioceptive experience of watching other moves and moving ourselves, this could change. If I am right, certain aspects of the observer's experience of dance can be enhanced by an awareness of the bodily feeling of dance. So I'd love to test these theories empirically. So my last research question is whether individuals who are generally more aware of their body or more or less attuned to their bodily sensations also report more bodily experiences. And then, so how do individual differences in body awareness relate to art experience? A short note on body awareness. So I'm interested in the role of body awareness in the experience of installation art. And with this, I do not only include proprioception, but also interoception. So for example, your heart beating, or exteroception, so which is sensing the space around you, and kinesthetics, which is related to movement. And in this study, I start with the self-report measure, the Maya-2, on interoception, and such questionnaire batteries are used in psychology to assess or control for individual differences. And short disclaimer, there is no widely accepted standard measurement for general proprioceptive accuracy, also because most of the proprioception is below the level of consciousness or conscious awareness. And also because all the tests that exist, they're super specific to individual body parts. So skin conductance is usually measured on the hands, or the joint position sense is on on how well you can point with your like knee or arm on a specific point. And there are even very task-specific differences within each aspect. So while one cannot assess general proprioceptive accuracy from a single test that, for example, only looks at the hand but leaves out the whole rest of the body. Yeah, but we have this interoception survey, and with this, I want to find out how generally aware participants are of their body. And by using this analysis, we can test whether general ability in body awareness, so the trait, influences the reported body awareness during the experience of the installation art, which then influences art experience. To sum up, research questions again, I showed you that installation art is designed for the body, and it's only complete when the body enters the installation and it's supposed to evoke bodily experiences. But this has never been empirically tested. And in addition to that, it has been proposed in psychological models of art experience that the body is a trigger for self-reflection. And also anecdotally, people have these self-reflective, profound experiences in this installation. So I want to see whether there's a different relationship between the bodily experience and the self-reflective experiences. And the question is whether people enjoy these kinds of bodily experiences. And lastly, do participants who are generally have higher body awareness, whether they also report more and more intense experiences related to the body, and how does this relate to art experience? This is just what the survey looked like, informed constant instructions at the beginning. I started with this open question on the bodily experience, then the bodily experience items, and then the art experience items, so the emotion and the cognitive self-reflection. And then we had this survey on individual differences in interoception, then some art appraisals, so whether the participants liked the art, whether they found it beautiful, whether they understood the art, and then demographics on like age, gender. I also asked them whether they are afraid of heights because it's high, their art preference, so whether they generally like installation art or contemporary art, whether they've been on this installation before, and if yes, how many times, and whether they experienced the installation alone or with other people. And at the end, there was an open text box in case someone wanted to say something. So just some summary, impact, future outlook. So I hope that this project will start a seed for the empirical investigation of the experience of installation art, and that I hope that I made clear that any fruitful investigation of art experience of installation art in empirical aesthetics research should include the experience of proprioception and the body. And this research can be embedded into 4E cognition, according to which cognition is embodied, extended, embedded, and enactive. So experiences based on the bodily features, motor skills, situatedness, and active engagement in the physical environment. So embodiment depends on our activity in the environment. Also, Svetlana Chernyshova mentioned this yesterday. So we're not a brain attached to a computer, but we are a brain in the body, in the environment, making experiences in the environment and doing actions in the environment. And so it's vital to consider these elements when empirically studying psychology. And art is just one special example of human psychological experience. And besides having a body and being able to move in order to explore art that I mentioned, like exploring, moving around with it, we also need the body to experience the feelings and emotions that play an important role in aesthetic experience. And I did not speak about this in aspect of the body in this experience, but there's a lot of interesting research, for example, this one that looked at body maps of emotional experiences while viewing art, so where emotions were experienced in the body. Yeah, and I hope that I can do this study design or a similar one with further installation artworks in the future to collect more data. I put together some books if you're interested in installation art on neuroaesthetics. Also the references that I mentioned. I would like to especially thank my supervisors in Vienna and Berlin in my lab and collaborators. Yeah, so that was my presentation. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you.
Thank you, Corinna, for this rich talk. Thank you very much. So now we have a look. Just a sec. I think if, but Elisa Caldorado has probably a question.
Yeah. So thanks for a really interesting talk. As someone who's been working on installation art for a few years now, I found it really, really interesting. So perhaps this is a naive question by someone who doesn't do empirically informed research, because I am a philosopher and an aesthetician. But I was wondering whether you or the team you are part of has considered doing research on the involvement of the imagination in the experience of installation art, and especially on the link between the fact that we undergo certain bodily experiences, proprioceptive experiences, while inside certain works of installation art, and the fact that we might be prompted to engage in specific imaginings by the very having of those experiences. So, for instance, when you describe Saraceno's work, I think in his own words, he says something like, "Oh well, this work is about, among other things, living in the clouds." Well, that is a metaphor, right? And in order to grasp that metaphor, we have to employ our imaginative abilities. And it seems that there might be an interesting link there to explore between how it feels for us to be inside that environment and how this prompts us to explore certain imaginings. So this is an idea that I think is relevant for the understanding of installation art, and I'm exploring it with completely different, purely philosophical means. And I was wondering whether you've thought about this and whether it can easily be included in an empirical study.
Yeah, thank you for this question. This is definitely super relevant, and I've thought about it. And the way I thought about that experimentally was to have one group of visitors enter an installation and have another group of participants view the installation that is recorded in a video or just photos of it. Because also during the COVID crisis, a lot of exhibitions were put online and like virtual exhibitions. So it could be a nice experimental design to compare the experience of the participants who are actually in the installation art and the participants who just view the installation in a like virtual exhibition and like imagine what it's like to be in the installation and experience it bodily, and then see whether they also report any bodily sensations. Yeah, but this has never been conducted before. So if there's a possibility that like an exhibition or installation art has been video recorded, I would totally like to take that opportunity.
Okay, great. I think Marcus is the next in the queue.
Thanks a lot for this very informative talk, both on two aspects, content-wise, but also the way you work. Because for me, as an armchair philosopher, armchair scientist, it's great to see these insights also into empirical work. Now, my question was, when the subgroup of us who visited Saraceno's net, we also filled in the survey, your survey, and some of us were wondering why you asked, for example, the parameter of guilt, whether someone felt guilt while being in the net. Now, your talk clarified it somehow, because you refer to this Geneva emotion wheel, and I guess this is some kind of standard in empirical research on emotions, and this is, I guess, why you used it. My question is, why do you leave in emotions that, at least prima facie, are irrelevant to the artwork? Because most of us thought, why is she asking about whether we felt guilty when being in the net? Isn't that irrelevant? Now, why would you? There might be a reason why you leave that in. That's my question.
First of all, thank you for taking part in the survey, and also I have to give credits to my colleague Hannah Kruft, who's currently standing in the museum. So you already hinted at that asking for emotions is like a standard thing, and this is the case. Yeah, I think if I would have only included emotions that I expected, this would have been a bit biased by me as a researcher. And in general, part of the artist project, we try to find out the range of emotions that are generally experienced in installation art, in art experiences in general. And we have this list of 80 emotions, and it just wasn't possible to include these 80 in this study because, if that's people spend half an hour, 1.5 hours in the museum, they don't want to sit there for half an hour filling out a survey. So I had to cut them off and then decided on this emotion wheel and then some individual extra emotions. Just to get a broad overview. And I think guilt can be an emotion that can be experienced and can pop up in the experience of art. Yeah.
Okay, great. So Robin.
Of course, thanks. I see. Thank you.
Thank you.
Robin Curtis would be next.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks so much for your talk. It was really super interesting. I have a question about the portion where you're dealing with corporeal response to form, rather than, say, specific representations that are identifiable as representations of objects. And one of the things that I'm interested in is the way in which form, when viewed in the light of mirror neuron research, is always linked, because of the question of intentions, to the intentions of a creator. In other words, the macaque grasps a peanut, and what's ascribed to the macaque in mirror neuron research is a particular intention, or that's understood to be the thing that's like a goal orientation. So it would seem to be logical then that the research on painting that you described also focuses on the intention of the creator. In other words, the making of a slit or the creation of a line. In other words, by a human agent. And because I work on audiovisual media, in other words, works that are created through the medium of a camera and are less connected to a creator, in other words, are not directly related to human activity necessarily. I'm very curious about the way in which perhaps it's possible to account for formal engagement through a kind of corporeal engagement with form that is not ascribed to a human agent. In other words, do we reinscribe? My question for you is, do we as viewers then reinscribe agency in a non-human medium? Or is it possible to test for ways in which we can see abstraction and abstract form as being corporeally experienced, but not filtered through an agent? In other words, not as the representation of an action performed by somebody who's gone before me, who had particular goals. Do you understand what I'm getting at? Like, how can we actually account for what we see in the context of a non-human medium?
Yeah, thank you for your interesting question. So I think the way this embodied simulation of abstract art is understood, or at least how I understood it, it's not so much about the form, but rather about the goal-directed movement. I go back to the slide, so that you can infer the action, the intended action of the artist in these abstract drawings. Yeah, and then the question would be whether we could also do that when we would know that this isn't by an artist, but say, for example, from a computer generated some AI. Because I know that we're really, like, humans are super good at putting intention into everything we see. So for example, if you see some scratches on a tree, then we think it was some beer or some human. And not that it was nature, but that it was someone. So I guess we're quite good at this. Yeah, but I think this hasn't been looked at. We did studies on like emotion recognition from human-made versus AI-generated art. That's something we looked at, but not with regards to this embodiment, but rather just can people recognize emotions from art that was made from humans versus the computer. Does this somehow answer your questions or give some further thinking to it?
Thank you. Yeah.
Warte, will be next.
Yeah, also thanks from my side for this talk. I've been following empirical aesthetics for quite some time. I remember 2007, I think I was with Helmut Leder in the sketches of a project of how we perceive pictures. And as you yourself described the development of this field, it started with fMRI scans, where people were very much isolated and watched reproductions of pictures. And then one saw which area of the brain was activated. And already at the time, my question was, so what actually do you find out when you find out that an area of the brain is activated? That some neurons in some area fire. Okay, you find out a correlation. This happens if in that situation. The underlying assumption or the ideology of that kind of research, of course, was that it was because the brain fires in that situation that we see it that way. But I think on the long run, this paradigm of brain-centeredness has been lost or has been neglected. You show now a methodology that is different. You also showed this, this, as you called it, ecologically more valid setting, where there was, as you said, a highly qualitatively good reproduction of the artwork, but still it wasn't the original. And you were measuring movements. And if I understood it correctly, you were measuring movements of individuals in front of this painting. And you could show that there's a correlation of the bodily movement to the intensity of the perception of the painting, right? So there was again a correlation between a certain kind of movement, a bodily movement, and a certain kind of, say, appreciation, involvement, and introspection also. And that's of course interesting. But now you work with, if I understand it correctly, you work with a questionnaire. And that makes me think of another sort of empirical approach to art, which is sociological. So in sociology, you might ask the same questions that you addressed to Thomas Saraceno, and you would do it for different purposes. You would find out how in society we deal with such artworks, and how certain persons, which maybe have also certain social qualifications, react to certain artworks. But you do seem to have a different approach. And so I have a twofold question. The one is, what do you find out actually, if you have all these questionnaires? Or what do you want to find out, other than a correlation between certain emotions and certain settings that are, in your terms, ecologically valid? And the second, maybe more interesting question is a follow-up to Elisa Calderola's question, something that I'm working out on now, which is one way of describing these works, these artworks, in difference to, say, when we collectively watch the TV news in the evening, seeing the horrors in the world, is that we don't really know what we have in front of our eyes. So we have to deploy some kind of imagination, but we do so, let's say, collectively. And I wonder whether it could be of interest for you, or what you would say, once you leave behind a bit this methodological, how do you say, a priori, or of the single individuum that you focus on, and rather focus on the social situation in which, say, installation art is seen. So if you would agree that there's something in installation art that presents us collectively with something that we have difficulties of assessing, of knowing how to move around it, then not only the object that we perceive or the situation we're in plays a role, but also how other people are reacting to it. And that might also inform our proprioception. So do you understand there's a twofold question? The one is what you want to find out, and the other is, in addition to Elisa Calderola, how would you think about, say, the interaction of bodies being relevant to art experience?
Yeah, thanks for this complex question. Just to quickly comment on the neuro stuff first, I agree that neurosthetics has been criticized as being quite reductionistic, like reducing the experience to this experience in the scanner. And I think that neurosthetics can help to say a lot about the workings of the brain, but cannot say so much about art. So I think art is an interesting stimuli to find out things about the brain, especially visual experiences. Yeah. And then the first of the two questions were what my aim was with this movement study, I think. So first of all, it's really a proof of concept. This has never been done before, and we were like the first lab to set up this design and looked at if we can even objectively track movement, if we can find these patterns. And then everything in analysis that we did was really super correlational. And this, of course, doesn't say much yet, but this was a first attempt to, for example, find out if like more engagement leads to like higher, like more intense art experiences, whether like people have to engage with the artwork to come up with experiences, or whether it's rather beneficial to like stand and not move at all, because then I think there's the stopping for knowledge hypothesis, that it's good that when you like that you have to stop and not move in order for all your resources in your brain to be able to perceive beauty, because otherwise the body would be engaged in moving. So there's not so many cognitive capacities left to like form a beauty judgment. So the question is whether maybe when people move more or less, there are different art experiences that can pop up. And then on top of that, the second question was the social aspect, I think. And for this experiment, we only let in one participant at the time, so we completely excluded this social aspect. And of course, in the future, that would be super interesting to look at, but this would also involve more quality, like control of everything. And I know that in sociology, there are observational studies where they looked at how participants, like museum visitors, interact to, for example, gain more meaning, or like try to understand an exhibition together with like photographs or like video observations. And yeah, this can be done descriptively, but I wonder how to do that in a quantitative way. And also there's research by my supervisor, Matthew Ryplowski, who at least found out for visual art in museums that it's not beneficial for the art experience to be with other people. There's one paper on it, you can find it on the internet at least. Yeah, did I?
if I, for example, play like pool, like billiard, in augmented reality, and I push a simulated ball against another one, would that be an actual action? Because we would get the illusion that we, for example, did an action like pushing one ball against the other, but we wouldn't get all the feedback that we would in the normal world. So I was just wondering about the notion of the actual actions and how mixed reality fits in the embodiment.
Super interesting question. Just a disclaimer, this is not my theory on weak and strong embodiment. It's by Gallagher 2018 in this paper, Building a Stronger Concept of Embodiment. And I think you understood it correctly, that the weak embodiment is the representation of actions and movements in the brain, but the strong embodiment is the actual execution of these. And I haven't thought about the VR one yet. I think this could somehow involve both forms. And now I want to go back and look at this paper and see if Gallagher mentioned VR experiences. So I cannot answer at this point, but it's a very interesting discussion.
Okay, thank you very much again for this really interesting talk. And I think Markus is going to have a few words at the end of the workshop, and I would say, Markus, take over.
Yeah, thanks, Juliana, and thanks, Corinna, again for your talk. Great input. Anyway, thank you very much, everyone. First of all, the speakers for your very informative, fruitful, stimulating, etc. input. I'm really glad you could be here with us, either on screen or there in the room where I could not be. So thanks for participating and all this input. Fantastic. Also, thank you to all the participants and the discussion. I made copies and Till made copies of the chat once in a while, and it's great to have had your questions and your comments and your input too. So thanks for that as well. And of course, thanks a lot to those of the team who are still there in the room. I'm so sorry I couldn't be there. Great that everything worked so well. Thanks for the technical support. Thanks for the support surrounding the workshop. So I'm grateful for all that. This has been the kick-off workshop, and I hope we will have many future workshops on proprioception in art, interoception, etc. in art. We'll get all back to you, the speakers, everyone who's interested. You know that we have this newsletter you can subscribe to. We are also on Instagram and Twitter, so join us there for and get information about future events. I hope I haven't forgotten to thank someone who is crucial, Eva, for example, our administrator. So thanks to Eva again for also support. And I hope I haven't forgotten to say anything which is of importance. I look at the tiles, I look into the room. Please add something should I have forgotten something important. I'm grateful to everyone. Many thanks. And hopefully I see you soon in person or on screen. Bye-bye. Thanks and have a good weekend.
Perfect.